Settle in, get comfortable, pull that blanket just a little bit higher, find that soft spot on your pillow, and let the world outside go quiet for a while. Tonight, we are going somewhere familiar. A fictional street in a fictional city in Rhode Island, where the houses all look slightly the same, where the neighborhood bar stays open too late, and where one particular family somehow keeps existing through catastrophe after catastrophe without ever really changing at all. We are going to spend some time with the Griffins, with Peter and Lois and their 3 children, with Brian the dog and Stewie the baby, with Quagmire next door and Joe on the other side of the street and Cleveland somewhere not too far away. But we are not here to watch them get into another misadventure. We are not here for the loud moments or the outrageous gags or the chaos that tends to follow Peter Griffin wherever he goes. We are here for something quieter than that, something slower. We are here for the stories underneath the stories, the real histories of these characters, the decisions that were made before a single frame was ever drawn, the voices that almost were, the inspirations that came from the strangest places, the small strange facts buried deep in the DNA of a show that has been running now for more than 25 years. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999. That date matters more than it might seem at first, because the show did not just quietly appear on a Tuesday night while most of America was distracted by something else. It debuted immediately after Super Bowl 33, which meant that millions of people who had been sitting with their friends and their nachos and their beer were suddenly watching a cartoon about a man named Peter Griffin and a baby with a football-shaped head who wanted to take over the world. 22 million people watched that first episode. That is not a number you stumble into. That is a cultural moment. And yet the show itself, the actual creation of it, was the opposite of a cultural moment. It was one very young man sitting alone in his kitchen at the Rhode Island School of Design, drawing frames by hand with a budget of $50,000, sleeping somewhere between very little and not at all, trying to bring something to life that had been bouncing around in his head for years. That man was Seth MacFarlane, and we will get to him in a great deal of detail later in this video. But right now, what matters is understanding the foundation that everything else rests on. Because Family Guy is not just a show with characters. It is a show where almost everything, from the way a character sounds to the shape of their head to the name they were given, came from somewhere unexpected. The city they live in is called Quahog, which is a real type of clam native to the New England coastline. A quahog is a hard-shell clam, thick and sturdy and deeply associated with Rhode Island culture, where clam chowder is not a suggestion but a way of life. MacFarlane picked that name deliberately, anchoring the show in a very specific kind of place. Not a generic American suburb, but something textured and regional. The street the Griffins live on is called Spooner Street. Their address is 31 Spooner Street, and the Swansons live at 33 and the Quagmires somewhere nearby in a house that, if you look closely across several seasons, seems to be arranged specifically to maximize the number of hidden beds available at any given moment. The entire fictional city of Quahog is said to be modeled after Cranston, Rhode Island. Cranston is a real place, a mid-sized city just south of Providence, and if you have ever been there, you might notice a certain working class, lived-in quality that shows up in the DNA of the Griffin family's world. It is a place with old triple-deckers and neighborhood bars, and a sense that things have been this way for a very long time and will probably continue being this way, which suits Peter Griffin perfectly. The show was originally intended to be something else entirely. Before it became a standalone series on Fox, Family Guy was actually in development as a series of animated short films for the sketch comedy program MAD-TV. That plan collapsed not because anyone disliked the idea, but because Mad TV simply did not have the budget to produce animation at the scale that Seth MacFarlane needed. Animation is expensive. Even rough, simple animation costs more than most people realize. When that door closed, MacFarlane turned to Fox. And Fox, having watched the success of King of the Hill, which had debuted in 1997, and demonstrated that adult animated comedies not made by Matt Groening could find an audience, was interested. But interested does not mean writing a blank check. What Fox offered MacFarlane was $50,000 and a challenge. Make us a 15-minute pilot. Show us what this is. That $50,000 is staggering in context. Most animated pilots at that time cost somewhere around $1 million. MacFarlane was being asked to do the same thing for 5% of that budget, from scratch, largely on his own. He spent 6 months doing it. He has described the experience in interviews as 6 months with no sleep and no life, just drawing like crazy in his kitchen. That pilot, completed in 1998 and pitched to Fox on May 15th of that year, contained the very first appearance of the Griffin family. They looked a little different. Lois had blonde hair in early designs. Some of the character proportions were slightly off from what they would eventually settle into. But the bones were there. Peter was there. Brian was there. Stewie was there, already plotting something. Fox loved it. They ordered 13 episodes immediately. And in July of 1998, the Fox Broadcasting Company officially announced that Family Guy would premiere in January 1999. The gap between that announcement and the actual premiere was used to finish animating those first episodes, to assemble a writing staff, to cast voice actors, and to figure out exactly what kind of show this was going to be. Some of those decisions were straightforward. Others were messy, complicated, and full of last-minute changes that would end up shaping the show in ways nobody expected. We are going to walk through all of it, character by character, fact by fact, in no particular hurry. The night is long and quiet, and there is no reason to rush. Let us start with the most complicated character on the show, the one at the center of everything, the one whose name is in the show's title if you count the family he leads. Let us start with Peter. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. It genuinely makes me smile to see people tuning in from all over the world, so say hello if you feel like it. And if you have not yet, consider subscribing so you never miss one of these long-form nights in. Section 2. Peter Griffin, the man behind the beer gut. Peter Griffin's full name is Justin Peter Lowenbro Griffin Sr. Take a moment with that, Lowenbro. The middle name of the most recognizable bumbling cartoon dad since Fred Flintstone is Lowenbräu, which is a German beer brand. The joke is sitting right there in the middle of his legal name, and it has been there since the very beginning, which tells you something about what kind of character Seth MacFarlane was building. Peter was not designed to be subtle. He was designed to be a walking collection of blue-collar appetites and genuine warmth wrapped in a body that the animators gave a specific and deliberate shape. He is heavy-set in a way that the show never tries to hide or make excuses for. His gut has its own visual gravity. His glasses are thick and slightly too small for his face. He has a round head that sits on a thicker neck, and his hands are always just a little too stubby for whatever he is trying to do with them. There is an argument to be made that Peter Griffin's silhouette is one of the most recognizable in the history of animation. That silhouette came from two different directions. The first direction was Larry. Before Peter Griffin existed, there was a character named Larry, who appeared in 2 short animated films that Seth MacFarlane made before Family Guy was ever a conversation. The first was his thesis film at the Rhode Island School of Design, completed in 1995 and titled The Life of Larry. The second was a follow-up called Larry and Steve, made in 1996 and actually broadcast on Cartoon Network in 1997 as part of their World Premiere Toons showcase. Larry was a middle-aged man. He was not particularly intelligent. He had a talking dog named Steve who was considerably more thoughtful than he was. If you watch those shorts now, the lineage is unmistakable. Larry became Peter, Steve became Brian. The show's core dynamic, the big lovable idiot and the articulate dog who has to deal with him, was fully formed in those student films years before Family Guy was greenlit. But Peter is not just Larry with a new name. When MacFarlane redesigned the character for the Fox pitch, he made changes. The voice changed significantly. The personality was sharpened in some places and softened in others. And the visual design drew from a second, very specific source. There was a security guard at the Rhode Island School of Design named Paul Timmons. MacFarlane has talked about Timmons in interviews, and the story has a kind of perfect creative logic to it. Timmons was, by MacFarlane's account, a man with absolutely no self-editing whatsoever. He said what he thought. He reacted to things directly and without filter. He had a voice and a way of carrying himself that MacFarlane found genuinely fascinating. That voice, that rhythm, that lack of internal editor, those qualities went into Peter Griffin. Timmons himself has acknowledged this in subsequent years, and there is something both funny and slightly surreal about being the real-world basis for one of the most famous animated characters ever created. Somewhere out there is a man who goes about his day knowing that a version of him in cartoon form has been watched by hundreds of millions of people across 25 years of television. The voice that McFarlane created for Peter is not his natural speaking voice. McFarlane speaks in a clear, slightly formal baritone that you hear clearly in interviews. Peter's voice is different, rounder, with that distinctive Rhode Island working-class inflection that is part Massachusetts accent and part something entirely its own. McFarlane developed it specifically for the character, building on what he had absorbed from Timmins and from the general sound of working-class New England. Peter's background, as established across the show's many seasons, is layered in ways that only become clear when you pay attention. He was not born a Griffin. That is one of the show's more interesting bits of mythology. His mother, Thelma Griffin, raised him, believing that his father was Francis Griffin, the man she was married to. Francis was a strict, deeply religious man of Irish Catholic heritage who disapproved of almost everything Peter did throughout his life. But the truth, revealed later in the series, is that Peter is the biological son of a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish traveler and something of a legend in the bars of Western Ireland. When Peter eventually travels to Ireland to find his biological father, he discovers a man who is in many respects an older and more raucously Irish version of himself. The apple did not fall far from the tree. It fell approximately 0 feet from the tree, rolled slightly, and came to rest against the same roots. This Irish heritage is part of why the show places Peter in a Catholic working-class New England context. Rhode Island has one of the largest Irish-American populations per capita of any state in the country, and that cultural texture runs through Peter's character even when the show is not explicitly pointing at it. Peter works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which produces the beer that appears most frequently in the show. Before that, in earlier seasons, he worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. The brewery is a more natural fit for his character, not just because of the beer, but because it connects him to a specific kind of regional identity. New England has a long and genuine brewing tradition, and putting Peter in that environment made sense. His friendship with Brian, his dog, is probably the most emotionally loaded relationship on the show in its early seasons. Peter treats Brian more like a friend than a pet, which is only possible because Brian behaves more like a friend than a pet. They drink together. They watch television together. Brian serves as Peter's conscience in ways that the children never quite managed to do. There is a reason that the original Larry and Steve shorts formed the prototype for the whole show. That specific dynamic, the big foolish guy and the wise skeptical dog who loves him anyway, is the engine that makes everything else run. The name Peter itself was chosen by McFarlane after trying a few options. Larry was already a name attached to the earlier character, and McFarlane wanted something that felt different while still grounding the character in a very specific American ordinariness. Peter Griffin has the sound of a real person. It does not announce itself as a cartoon name. The Griffin surname is similarly grounded. It is common without being generic. It suggests a specific cultural background, vaguely Irish or Welsh in origin, without announcing anything too loudly. The Griffins are supposed to feel like a family you might actually know, and the name choice is part of that. Peter's physique is one of the most discussed visual choices in the show's history. He is drawn as genuinely large, not stylized cartoon large, but specifically and intentionally overweight in a way that the show never treats as a punchline about his body. The jokes around Peter's size are almost always about what he tries to do with that body rather than about the body itself, which is a subtle but important distinction. He is not the butt of fat jokes so much as a person whose ambitions frequently outpace his physical reality, which is a different thing entirely and one that audiences responded to with affection rather than discomfort. His laugh is one of the most distinctive sounds in animated television history. That particular wheeze, followed by the repetitive snort, has been imitated and parodied and referenced so many times across popular culture that most people can reproduce a rough version of it without having ever consciously studied it. McFarlane developed that laugh for the character and has described it as something that just emerged during the early recording sessions and immediately felt right. In the early seasons, Peter is a man of genuine warmth underneath the chaos. He messes things up constantly and consistently, but the show always brings him back to a moment of real affection for his family. He loves Lois in a way that is obvious even when he is doing something that makes loving him very difficult. He loves his children, even if expressing that love often comes out sideways and wrong. There was a specificity to early Peter that the most devoted fans of the show tend to describe with real nostalgia. His pop culture references were concentrated in the 1970s and 1980s, which was the childhood era of someone born in the early to mid-1960s. His obsessions had an internal logic to them. His friendship with Quagmire and Cleveland and Joe was grounded in genuine affection. He was the kind of man who would absolutely do the wrong thing and then feel genuinely bad about it, which gave the character a moral weight that kept him sympathetic even in his worst moments. Something that most casual viewers do not know is that Peter's glasses are a direct visual homage to Paul Timmons, who apparently also wore glasses of a specific heavy-framed variety that McFarlane found charming. So when you look at Peter Griffin on screen, you are looking at a version of a real man's glasses transposed onto a cartoon face. There is something unexpectedly personal about that. Peter is described in the show's internal mythology as standing 6 feet tall, which creates its own kind of visual joke because cartoons can distort scale easily, and the Peter you see on screen feels simultaneously enormous and somehow exactly the right size for his world. He has, across the show's run, held an astonishing number of jobs beyond the brewery. He has been a fisherman, a Renaissance fair knight, a pro wrestler, an actor, a mayor, a lumberjack, and a great many other things, each time with equal confidence and roughly equal incompetence. The brewery is the constant, the job that always seems to be there waiting for him when each new adventure runs its course. His relationship with alcohol is treated as a given rather than a problem, which reflects the specific cultural context the show is drawing from. A man in a working-class New England neighborhood who drinks beer at the bar with his friends is not presented as someone with a pathology. He is presented as someone living a specific kind of life that millions of Americans recognize. Whether that framing is entirely responsible is a whole other conversation, but it is a deliberate creative choice that roots Peter in a recognizable world rather than a satirized one. The chicken. We have to talk about the chicken. At various points throughout the series, Peter encounters a giant chicken named Ernie. Their relationship is one of the show's most absurd running gags, a periodic battle of genuinely extraordinary violence that the show commits to with absolute sincerity. These fights go on for minutes at a time. They destroy buildings. They extend through multiple environments. They follow no coherent narrative logic and do not connect to whatever the episode's actual plot might be. What most viewers do not know is that the chicken was originally supposed to appear only once. He was not designed as a recurring character. He was a one-off joke, a way to blow up a single episode with something absurd and then move on. But the audience response was so strong, the visual spectacle of Peter fighting a human-sized chicken with total dedication was so weird and funny and somehow satisfying that the writers brought Ernie back. And then again, and the fights became more elaborate and more expensive to animate each time. Ernie the Giant Chicken is now one of the show's most reliable recurring elements, and he exists entirely because somebody decided to do something insane once and it worked out. Peter Griffin is, in many ways, the reason Family Guy became a cultural institution rather than just a popular cartoon. Characters like him, big and loud and flawed but warm, have a way of making people feel something they cannot quite name, something like recognition, maybe. Something like affection for a kind of person that television does not always treat with affection. He is not a genius. He is not a good decision maker. He is not always a good person. But in the right light, in the quieter moments, you can see what Seth MacFarlane was going for when he sat in his kitchen at the Rhode Island School of Design and started drawing a version of Paul Timmons as a cartoon dad. He was going for somebody real. Section 3. Lois Griffin, the woman who holds everything together. Lois Griffin's voice was born in a Hungarian Long Island accent that Alex Borstein first heard from her own cousin. That is not a strange sentence when you understand how voice acting actually works. The best voices for animated characters rarely come from nowhere. They come from somewhere very specific, from a person the actor knows, or a mannerism they have studied, or a sound they heard once in a particular place at a particular time that embedded itself in their memory. For Borstein, that sound was her cousin. She has described this in interviews with genuine affection. The cousin in question grew up on Long Island, New York, with a Hungarian family background, and the resulting accent was, as Borstein once told NPR, like a cat dying but in the most endearing way possible. It was the kind of voice that you could not unhear. Warm, slightly nasal, specific in a way that could only come from that particular combination of cultures and geography. When Seth MacFarlane approached Borstein about the show, she was performing in live stage shows in Los Angeles. He caught her doing a particular sketch in which she was playing a redhead mother, and something about that performance and that energy convinced him she was the right person for Lois. The cousin's voice, slightly adjusted and refined for the character, became the foundation. It is worth noting what Alex Borstein was doing before Family Guy, because her background shapes the way she approached the role. She was a cast member and writer on Mad TV, the sketch comedy show that had actually been the original potential home for Family Guy before the budget problems killed that plan. On Mad TV, she was best known for a character called Mrs. Swan, a scene-stealing recurring character with an absurdist logic that made her unpredictable and funny in a completely different way from Lois. She was also, before Mad TV, writing for animated series. She wrote for Pinky and the Brain in the early 1990s. She had voice acted on other shows. She brought a genuine craft to the work, not just a funny voice, but an understanding of how to build a character from the inside out. Lois Griffin's full name is Lois Patrice Griffin, née Pewterschmidt. That maiden name carries its own weight. The Pewterschmidts are presented in the show as an extremely wealthy family, old money in the New England style, the kind of family with a compound and a private chef and a father named Carter who makes no effort whatsoever to conceal his contempt for Peter Griffin. The fact that Lois came from that background and chose Peter anyway is one of the show's foundational mysteries. It is addressed directly in some episodes and danced around in others, but it is always there as context. What made this woman, who could have married anyone, who grew up with resources and opportunities and a family name that opened doors, choose a man who routinely does not know what day of the week it is? The show's answer, when it bothers to give one, is basically love in its most irrational and stubborn form. Lois loves Peter the way some people love things that are inexplicable and somewhat inconvenient. She has tried to understand it and eventually stopped trying. He is her person, and that is that. But Lois is far more than just the patient wife of an impatient husband. Her backstory, scattered across the series in fragments, reveals a person with a genuinely complicated history. Before she settled into the Spooner Street house with Peter and the children, Lois Pewterschmidt was living a very different life. She played piano at a professional level, something that gets referenced in early seasons and then largely disappears as the show went on. She had relationships with rock musicians. The show at various points connects her romantically to several actual artists from the 1980s, which puts her in a specific era and cultural context. She was not the suburban housewife she appeared to be. She was someone who had lived and made choices and arrived at her current life not by accident but by a series of deliberate decisions that the show never fully unpacks. Her older brother Patrick is one of the darker details in the show's mythology. Patrick Pewterschmidt was, in the show's history, sent to a mental institution after it emerged that he had become a serial killer. His weapon of choice was particularly absurd, as is appropriate for Family Guy. But the point is that Lois grew up in a house where this brother existed, where something that serious was happening underneath the surface of the wealthy family's life. Her cheerful composure takes on a different cast when you know that. Her father, Carter, is played for comedy but is written with a consistent psychology. Carter Pewterschmidt is a man who genuinely loves his daughter and also genuinely cannot accept her choice of husband, and he navigates those two facts by alternating between kindness toward Lois and open hostility toward Peter. He is never deliberately cruel to Lois herself, only to the man she married, which makes him one of the show's more coherent recurring characters. His dislike of Peter is petty and snobbish, but it is not without some rational basis, and that ambiguity makes him funnier than a straightforward villain would be. Lois's age is one of those details the show has been inconsistent about over many seasons, as long-running animated shows tend to be. The most specific reference puts her at 43, which was mentioned in a season 11 episode. But the show has never committed to a hard timeline, and the characters do not age in any meaningful way, so these numbers function more as reference points than as actual continuity. What Borstein brings to the character, beyond the voice, is a particular kind of comedic intelligence. Lois has an arc within any given episode that requires someone who can play both the sane person reacting to chaos and the occasional participant in that chaos. She is not a passive observer. She has her own impulses, her own moments of breaking with the responsible wife and mother role, and those moments require a performer who can make the transition feel believable. There is an episode in the earlier seasons where Lois becomes a model, and the comedy comes partly from how genuinely good she is at it, which complicates the easy narrative about her domestic role. There are episodes where she runs for political office. There are episodes where she reveals hidden skills or appetites that contradict the patient homemaker surface. The show at its best used those moments to suggest that Lois was never as simple as she appeared, that the woman who wrangled Peter and managed the house was doing so out of choice rather than limitation. Borstein herself has described the voice as something that required careful calibration. The original version she brought from the stage show was considerably slower and drawlier than what ended up on screen. MacFarlane heard it and told her, according to her own retelling, that it would make a 4-hour show. They worked together to speed it up, to sharpen the timing while keeping the specific sound that made it distinctive. The result is what you hear now, something that has its own personality without calling too much attention to itself. Lois Griffin is voiced with what sounds like effortlessness, but is actually the product of very deliberate choices about how a character like this should sound. Warm enough to be maternal, sharp enough to be funny, slightly exasperated enough to be believable given who she is married to. Her relationship with her children is individual and specific in the ways that good parenting always is. She is protective of Chris in a way that suggests she sees more in him than he sees in himself. She has a complicated relationship with Meg that the show sometimes addresses directly and sometimes uses as the foundation for crueler jokes. And with Stewie, she is almost entirely unaware of the degree to which she is the focal point of a baby's elaborate revenge fantasies. That last part is one of the show's great running jokes. Lois picks Stewie up, Lois feeds Stewie, Lois changes Stewie, and Stewie, in his head, is narrating her destruction in vivid detail while accepting the applesauce. The gap between what Lois sees, a baby, a little person who needs taking care of, and what Stewie actually is, an armed and dangerous genius with a detailed plan for her murder, is the source of some of the show's most consistent comedy. And it all depends on Lois being genuinely oblivious, genuinely present as a loving mother, which Borstein sells completely. Lois's voice is also technically Alex Borstein's Hungarian Long Island cousin immortalized in animation. Somewhere on Long Island there is a woman who speaks in a very specific way, and because of that, a cartoon character on a Fox animated show has been heard by more people than the population of most countries. That is not nothing. That is actually remarkable. Section 4. Stewie Griffin, the Tiny Tyrant. Stewie Griffin does not actually have a British accent. This is not a creative reinterpretation or a fan theory. It is a fact revealed within the show itself, in a season 16 episode called Send in Stewie, Please, where Stewie visits a therapist and ultimately admits the truth. The British accent is an affectation, a performance, something he cultivated deliberately as a form of armor against the world he found himself in. In that episode, we hear what Stewie describes as his real voice. It sounds American. It sounds like a cross between Peter and Brian, which makes a strange genetic sense. The accent he has been wearing for 16 seasons of television is, as he tells his therapist, a coat of armor to get him through the day, an image he cultivated so he could feel special. There is something unexpectedly melancholy in that. The most distinctive voice on the show, the most quoted and imitated and recognizable sound in the whole Family Guy universe, was never real. Stewie chose it. He chose to sound like a villain from a British period piece because it made him feel like himself, or at least like the version of himself he wanted to be. The actual origin of that accent, from Seth MacFarlane's perspective rather than Stewie's fictional one, is one of the best creative stories in the show's history. MacFarlane has explained in interviews that he was reading a biography of Alan J. Lerner, who was the lyricist behind the 1964 musical My Fair Lady. My Fair Lady is, at its core, a story about accents and class and the way voice shapes identity, which turns out to be deeply appropriate given what we just discussed about Stewie's accent. In reading about Lerner and the production of the film, MacFarlane became interested in Rex Harrison, who plays Henry Higgins in the movie. Harrison's performance as Higgins is a specific kind of patrician English male, educated, faintly contemptuous, deeply convinced of his own correctness, possessed of a voice that seems to expect the world to organize itself around his preferences. MacFarlane found this vocal quality fascinating. He describes Stewie as essentially an evil Rex Harrison. The way he captures it is through a falsetto impression, pitching his voice higher than his natural register and adding that particular clipped quality that you associate with upper-class British speech of a certain vintage. It is not entirely realistic as a British accent. It is not the kind of accent you would necessarily hear in London today, but it has an internal consistency and a theatrical quality that makes it perfect for a baby who is secretly a supervillain. Stewie's full name is Stuart Gilligan Griffin. He was born on the 11th of September 1998, according to the show's internal mythology, which gives him a birthday of some significance, though the show itself has not made much of the coincidence. He is perpetually 1 year old, which the show established in a Season 1 episode called Chitty Chitty Death Bang and then essentially left as a permanent feature of the character's existence. This is one of those things that animated shows do and live-action shows cannot. A human baby cannot be played by the same actor for 25 years and remain 1 year old. A drawn baby can be whatever age the story requires and then return to baseline the next episode. Stewie has been 1 year old since 1999 and will presumably remain 1 year old for however many seasons the show continues to produce. His head is shaped like a football, which is the observation that almost every other character in the show makes about him at some point, usually with a tone of mild bewilderment. This is an intentional design choice, a visual shorthand for the idea that Stewie is not quite like other babies, that there is something slightly off about him before he opens his mouth and starts discussing world domination. The colors he wears, the white shirt tucked into red overalls, are another deliberate choice. Red and white together suggest something bright and slightly ominous at the same time. Some people have pointed out that the color palette calls to mind classic villain aesthetics without being so obviously villainous that Lois would have reason to be concerned. In the first season of Family Guy, Stewie's primary mission is matricide and world domination, in roughly that order of priority. His plan to kill Lois is a constant backdrop to every episode. He builds ray guns, he builds mind control devices, he constructs weather-altering machines. He speaks to these plans in the measured tones of someone who has thought them through very carefully and finds them entirely reasonable. Most of the other characters cannot understand him. This is one of the show's more interesting pieces of world-building. When Stewie speaks, the adults around him generally hear baby sounds. They see him gesturing with his tiny arms and interpret it as normal infant behavior. Only occasionally does someone outside Brian seem to catch what he is actually saying, and those moments are played for surprise rather than as the established norm. Brian is the exception. Brian can understand Stewie clearly and fully, which is the foundation of their friendship and also, in the early seasons, the foundation of Stewie's frustration. What is the point of an elaborate monologue about your plans for global conquest if the only audience member who can hear you is the family dog? Their relationship evolves over the course of the show in ways that divided the fan base considerably. In the beginning, Brian and Stewie interact as the show's most intelligent characters in a house full of people who are not. Their dynamic is built on mutual recognition. Stewie respects Brian because Brian is the only one who talks back. Brian appreciates Stewie because Stewie is at least interesting, which is more than Peter offers most of the time. What most people do not know about the early seasons of Stewie is how much the character's backstory was left deliberately vague. MacFarlane has said in interviews that he never fully decided how much of what Stewie does is real and how much is happening only in his head. When Stewie builds a time machine in his bedroom, does that actually happen? When he fires a ray gun, are those consequences real? The show's early seasons maintain a productive ambiguity about this, letting the audience decide how literally to take a 1 year old's supervillainy. His teddy bear, Rupert, is one of Stewie's most consistent companions, and in many ways the character he is most emotionally honest with. Stewie speaks to Rupert in private in a way he never speaks to Brian or anyone else. The bear does not respond. The bear is a stuffed toy. But Stewie's relationship with Rupert reveals something about him that the public-facing evil genius persona conceals. Somewhere inside the villain there is a baby, and the baby needs comfort. Stewie's birthday of September 11th is worth mentioning briefly in a different context. The show's second episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, was originally scheduled to air in September of 2001 but was pulled after the September 11 attacks due to its content involving aviation themes. This led to production shuffles that affected several early season episodes and their original airing order. The complexities of what aired when and in what order are part of why die-hard Family Guy fans who try to watch the show in strict chronological order sometimes find themselves confused. Seth MacFarlane himself has a connection to September 11th that the show was careful not to highlight during this period. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 out of Boston's Logan Airport on the morning of the 11th of September 2001. He missed the flight due to a combination of a hangover and a scheduling error with his travel agent. Flight 11 was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. We do not need to dwell on what that means or what it must feel like to be that person. But it is a piece of real history connected to the show that its creator carries with him, and it is impossible to understand the full context of Family Guy's early years without acknowledging it exists. Stewie's obsession with musicals is one of his more enduring character traits across both his early villainous incarnation and his later, more open version. He is genuinely passionate about Broadway, about theater, about the specific kind of dramatic performance that takes place on a stage in front of a live audience. This interest is consistent with the Rex Harrison influence in his voice. The same world that produced My Fair Lady is the world that Stewie's aesthetic imagination inhabits. He has, in various episodes, demonstrated remarkable musical talent. He can compose. He can perform. He has an instinct for spectacle that would serve him well in show business, which is perhaps not so different from world domination when you think about it. Both require a large audience, a careful plan, and the willingness to commit fully to the performance. His relationship with his teddy bear gets one of the show's most emotionally charged moments in a later season episode where Brian, in a moment of petulance, destroys Rupert by chewing the bear to pieces. The fallout from that moment between Stewie and Brian is played genuinely straight as real grief and real anger, which is one of those moments where the show reaches for something that functions like actual emotion rather than just comedy. Stewie's voice requires Seth MacFarlane to maintain the falsetto consistently across recording sessions that, for a show producing 20-plus episodes a season, can be physically demanding. MacFarlane has mentioned in interviews that keeping Stewie's voice distinct from his own, while also keeping it distinct from Peter and from Brian across long recording sessions, requires genuine concentration. One fact that most fans do not know is that in the original pilot pitch, the version of Stewie that appeared was slightly different in both design and delivery. The football head was there, the overalls were there, but the specific cadence of the voice was still being calibrated. What you hear in the very early episodes is already distinctive but has a slightly rougher quality than what the character settled into by the end of the first season. The final, perfected Stewie voice, the one that became iconic, arrived fully formed somewhere in the back half of the first season. By the time the show hit its stride, he was already the character that people quoted to each other at work the next morning. "What the devil have you done with my time machine? Blast." These things never work the way you intend them to. There is a reason those lines sound funny even reading them silently. It is the combination of vocabulary and context. A baby in a diaper using words like blast as an expletive and discussing the theoretical mechanics of time travel as an everyday frustration. The comedy is in the gap, always in the gap, between what Stewie looks like and what Stewie is. Section 5. Brian Griffin, the dog who thinks he is a man. Brian Griffin is the only character in Family Guy for whom Seth MacFarlane uses his natural speaking voice, not a modified version of his voice, not a pitch-shifted or accent-adjusted or character-processed version. His actual everyday speaking voice, the one he uses in interviews and on red carpets and when ordering coffee, Brian Griffin sounds like Seth MacFarlane sounds when he is just being himself. This is remarkable for several reasons. MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's main characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Glenn Quagmire. For 3 of those 4, he is doing something deliberate and crafted with his voice, making adjustments that separate the character from himself. But for Brian, the family dog, the one character on the show who is literally an animal, he uses his real voice. There is a funny philosophical reversal in that. The least human member of the Griffin household sounds the most like an actual human being. While Peter's voice is a version of a Rhode Island working-class man, and Stewie's voice is a falsetto impression of Rex Harrison playing a Victorian villain, Brian just sounds like Seth MacFarlane going about his day. MacFarlane has said that Brian is his favorite character on the show. He keeps a picture of the fictional dog on the door of his office. There is something personal in his affection for Brian that goes beyond the practical reality that Brian is just Seth MacFarlane speaking normally. Brian is in some ways the character closest to who MacFarlane imagines himself to be or aspires to be. Literary, culturally engaged, a little melancholy, capable of great warmth when he allows himself to be. Brian's origins go back to the same student films that gave us Peter. In The Life of Larry and Steve, the character who would become Brian was Steve, the intellectual dog who accompanied the character who would become Peter. Steve was the thoughtful one. Steve saw clearly what Larry could not. Steve was, in a real sense, the conscience of those early films. When the characters were redesigned for Family Guy, Steve became Brian and the basic dynamic was preserved but deepened. Brian is not just smarter than Peter. He is also more emotionally complex than Peter. He has wounds that Peter does not fully understand, and he carries them in ways that the show explores with more care than it gives to most characters. Brian's backstory, when the show takes the time to lay it out, is genuinely poignant. He was born on a farm in Austin, Texas, in a litter of 5 puppies. His mother was a dog named Biscuit. His father was a dog named Coco. At some point during his early life, he was abandoned by his mother, and the show has referenced this as the source of several of his adult behavioral patterns. The excessive drinking, the romantic instability, the difficulty committing to anything for very long. He ended up as a stray, living on the streets, before Peter Griffin found him and brought him home. This is the origin story told in the Season 1 episode Brian Portrait of a Dog, which is one of the show's stronger early-season character studies, and one that established Brian as someone whose sophistication and apparent confidence were things he had built deliberately rather than inherited. Brian attended Brown University, which is one of the Ivy League schools located in Providence, Rhode Island. This is appropriately local. Brown is within driving distance of Quahog in the show's geography, and it is the kind of place that a dog with intellectual ambitions might reasonably find himself attending. He is also a member of Mensa, the High IQ Society, which the show has referenced in passing without making it a central part of his identity. His cultural interests are wide and consistently referenced. He loves jazz and opera. He can sing all 4 parts of a barbershop quartet simultaneously, a detail mentioned once and then left there as a beautiful piece of character information that the show never explains or justifies. He speaks French fluently. He speaks Tagalog. He has a working knowledge of Spanish. He has been invited, within the show's fiction, to write for The New Yorker. All of this would be incredibly impressive if Brian were a person. As a dog, it is either more impressive or somehow funnier, depending on how you look at it. He drives a car. Specifically, he drives a silver 2004 Toyota Prius. The show established this in Season 7, and the car became a recurring visual element. The license plate reads BRI-D0G with a 0 rather than an O. The bumper has a sticker supporting Dennis Kucinich's 2004 presidential campaign. This is an absurd level of detail for a minor visual element in an animated show, and it is exactly the kind of thing that Family Guy tends to do at its best. Brian's novel is one of the show's longest-running character details. He has been working on it since before the series began, by the internal logic of the show, and for much of the show's run it serves as a symbol of everything he aspires to and cannot quite achieve. The novel exists. He references it frequently. He works on it. But it is never finished, never published, and by Season 9, when he does publish a book, it is not the novel but a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It that becomes a bestseller for reasons that have nothing to do with literary merit. Brian's relationship with Peter is the show's most important friendship, and it functions on a very specific emotional logic. Peter needs Brian to tell him the truth, even if he does not listen to it. Brian needs Peter to need him, even if he sometimes wishes he could be elsewhere. They are bound together in a way that both of them seem to have accepted without fully understanding. The death of Brian Griffin in the Season 12 episode Life of Brian is one of the most genuinely shocking moments in the show's history. Brian is hit by a car, and the scene is played without the usual comedic cushioning. He dies. The family mourns him. A new dog, a character named Vinny, is introduced as his replacement. The episode that revealed Brian's death trended on social media for days. People were genuinely devastated. Petitions circulated. News outlets ran articles about a fictional dog's death with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for actual events. The emotional investment in Brian, built over more than a decade of television, turned out to be enormous. And then, just 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian comes back, Vinny disappears, everything resets. The internet's reaction to this was a different kind of intensity than the reaction to the death. The death prompted grief. The resurrection prompted fury. Many people felt genuinely manipulated by the death and resurrection, as though the show had used their emotional connection to a character as a mechanism for generating buzz with no intention of following through on the consequence. MacFarlane's explanation, given in subsequent interviews, was essentially that the show needed to shake things up and that the audience response to both the death and the return had proven the character's importance. The implication was that the resurrection was always part of the plan, rather than a panic response to viewer outrage. Whether you believe that depends somewhat on how charitably you view the situation. What is beyond dispute is that the whole episode confirmed something about Brian Griffin that the show rarely acknowledged explicitly. People care about him more than they care about almost any other character. More than they care about Quagmire or Cleveland or Joe, all of whom could theoretically exit the show without generating the level of emotional upheaval that Brian's 4-week absence produced. Brian's car, the Prius, is also a small joke about Brian's self-image. He is the kind of person who drives a Prius in 2004 when the car was still a visible statement about environmental consciousness and a certain kind of progressive identity. Quagmire, in one of the show's later seasons, calls Brian out specifically for the Prius as part of a long list of grievances, and Brian's inability to defend it without sounding exactly as pretentious as Quagmire is accusing him of being is one of the funnier exchanges in the later series. Brian was born on the 20th of January 2000, according to the show's birthday reference, though he does not age in the traditional sense and is described at various points as being approximately 7 years old in dog years, which would make him around 10 years old in human terms, which does not quite square with his ability to attend university, drive a car, and order martinis. The show is not particularly concerned with the mathematics of this. He has a son. This is a detail that the show introduced and then handled with what can generously be described as inconsistency. A human woman had a child by Brian, and the existence of that child has appeared in some episodes and been completely absent from others, as though the writers collectively forget about the son in between the episodes where he becomes relevant. Brian orders dry martinis the way Peter orders beer. It is his constant companion, his social lubricant, and also one of the show's visual signals about the gap between his self-image and his actual behavior. Brian sees himself as someone who drinks martinis, someone cultured and refined. The fact that he drinks them as frequently and compulsively as Peter drinks Pawtucket Patriot Ale suggests that the martini is performing the same emotional function as the beer, which is to say it is making a difficult life slightly more manageable. Seth MacFarlane's favorite character being the one he voices with, his real voice is the kind of detail that does not surprise you when you hear it, but that you find yourself turning over afterward. There is something revealing about it. When MacFarlane speaks as Brian, he is, in some sense, speaking as himself. The literary ambitions, the cultural pretensions, the deep affection for people he finds frustrating, the capacity for real warmth that coexists with chronic selfishness. Maybe what MacFarlane loves about Brian is that Brian is the character in whom he can most clearly see his own reflection. That is, admittedly, speculative. But speculation is allowed when the night is quiet and you are comfortable and there is nothing urgent happening outside the window. Section 6. Meg Griffin. 3 voices and 1 unlucky teenager. Megan Griffin was voiced by 3 different women before she was voiced by the woman you almost certainly associate with the character today. That is the kind of fact that even longtime fans of the show often do not know in its complete form. Most people know that Mila Kunis took over from Lacey Chabert after the first season. Fewer people know that Chabert was not the first. And almost nobody knows the entire chain of events that led to a 15-year-old girl from Ukraine named Milena Kunis walking into an audition and delivering a line reading that Seth MacFarlane later said just nailed the tone he had been searching for. The story begins with Cree Summer. Cree Summer is a voice acting legend. She is the kind of person whose body of work is so extensive that listing it would take longer than this entire section. Winona from Dino Riders, Elmira from Tiny Toon Adventures, Susie Carmichael from Rugrats, Numba 5 from Codename, Kids Next Door, Foxy Love from Drawn Together. She has been the voice of more animated characters than most people could name in 5 minutes of concentrated effort. She was the original choice to voice Meg Griffin. She began recording work for the role, and then she was replaced. The specifics of why Cree Summer did not end up as Meg's voice have never been fully public. The show has never addressed it directly. Summer herself has not given extensive interviews on the subject. What we know is that she was cast and then she was not, and that after her departure, Rachel McFarlane, Seth MacFarlane's sister, provided Meg's voice for the original 15-minute pilot pitch that Seth brought to Fox. That pilot was the one that convinced Fox to order the series. It is the demo that contained the first appearance of the Griffin family and that Seth MacFarlane spent 6 months creating. In it, you can hear a version of Meg that is slightly different from either the Chabert or Kunis versions that followed. Rachel McFarlane has a particular voice quality that her brother clearly appreciated, and you can hear the family resemblance if you watch the original pitch alongside early broadcast episodes. When the show was picked up and went into full production for its Fox debut, Lacey Chabert was hired to voice Meg. Chabert was, in 1999, a recognizable young actress. She had spent several years as the child character Claudia Salinger on the Fox drama Party of Five, which was a serious and acclaimed show about siblings raising themselves after their parents died in an accident. She was known. She had a fan base. She had the kind of profile that made her casting feel like a real get for the show. She also had experience in animation. She was already Eliza Thornberry on The Wild Thornberrys, which would eventually become one of the more beloved animated shows of the late 1990s and early 2000s. She understood the particular craft of creating a character with only your voice, without the physical presence and facial expressions that support live-action acting. Chabert voiced Meg for the entire first season and for some episodes that aired in the second season due to production scheduling quirks. If you watch early Family Guy episodes carefully, you can often hear the distinction between a Chabert Meg and a Kunis Meg. Though, after 25 years of associating the character with Kunis, it requires a focused ear. Chabert's departure from the role has been described by everyone involved as completely amicable. Seth MacFarlane told IGN in 2003 that he thought there was a mistake in her contract, and that she apparently had not intended to be involved for the full run of the show. Chabert herself has said that the scheduling became impossible to manage between her work on Party of Five, her school commitments, and the regular production demands of a network animated series. She was, at the time, a teenager managing a demanding career, and something had to give. The fact that Chabert's work in the first season went uncredited is one of those industry details that sounds more scandalous than it probably is. Animation credits work differently from live-action credits, and it was not uncommon in that era for voice actors to work under contract arrangements that did not always result in standard on-screen credit. The show did eventually acknowledge her contribution in later seasons through a series of meta-jokes about her role, including an episode where Brian references Lacey Chabert's name in a way that is clearly acknowledging the original casting, and a later episode that paired Chabert and Kunis in the same scene for the first time. That episode, from season 17, involved Meg competing in a downhill ski race at the Winter Olympics and inexplicably encountering Lacey Chabert also competing in the same race. Chabert tells Meg that the Olympics should have been hers. They both yell at each other. It is a brief moment, but it officially made Chabert the only actress to ever appear in an episode of Family Guy, in which she also originally played the main character. Mila Kunis was 15 years old when she auditioned for the role of Meg Griffin. She was already working on that 70s show, the Fox sitcom that ran from 1998 through 2006. And that made her a recognizable face in American television, but she was still genuinely young. She had emigrated from Chernivtsi, in what was then the Soviet Union and is now Ukraine, at age 7 with her family. Her parents moved the family to Los Angeles specifically to give their children better opportunities, and by the time she was 15, Mila was working consistently as an actress. The audition line that Seth MacFarlane remembers is one where Meg calls Peter an idiot. He has said in interviews that Kunis delivered it in a way that captured exactly the exhausted, defeated, trying very hard not to care quality he wanted from the character. The tone was right. Something about it clicked. Kunis has been Meg Griffin ever since. One of the more interesting aspects of Kunis's performance over the years is that she has remained almost exclusively Meg while her co-stars have branched out extensively. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 main characters and dozens of recurring ones. Alex Borstein does Lois and multiple other roles. Seth Green voices Chris but has also appeared in the show in other capacities. Mila Kunis has been, for 25+ years, almost entirely just Meg. That is a remarkable commitment to a single character. The character herself has an interesting distinction from the rest of her family. Meg is the most normal person in the Griffin household. She has normal teenage problems. She wants to be popular. She wants to be liked. She has crushes on boys. She worries about her appearance. She has ambitions that feel proportionate to someone her age. Surrounded by a father who routinely breaks reality, a baby who builds time machines, a talking dog working on an unfinished novel, and a mother with a complicated past, Meg's ordinariness is its own kind of extraordinary. The show's treatment of Meg across its run is something the transcript you may have provided goes into in considerable detail, so we will not replow that ground here. What is worth noting from a character fact perspective is that Meg Griffin's full name is Megan Griffin, a name that sounds real and grounded in a way that some of the other family members' names do not. Meg is a name with history. It is a name that fits a teenager who wants to be seen as a real person rather than as the daughter of Peter Griffin. She is canonically 17 years old throughout the show, which, given the show's resistance to aging any of its characters, means she has been 17 since 1999. That is a very long 17-year-old run. Her various interests and skills, scattered across the show's many seasons, paint a picture of someone with more depth than the show usually gives her credit for. She plays the flute, she has written poetry. In The Simpsons crossover episode, she discovers a genuine talent for the saxophone, taught to her by Lisa Simpson, who presumably recognizes a fellow underappreciated creative person when she meets one. She has shown competitive athletic ability in certain episodes. She is, when the show allows her to be, considerably more capable and interesting than her position in the family hierarchy suggests. There is a specific piece of production history around Meg's singing voice that most fans do not know. When an episode required Meg to actually sing on screen, rather than just speak, Mila Kunis did not always provide the singing voice. For the Season 4 episode Don't Make Me Over, in which Meg gets a makeover and becomes temporarily popular, the singing was done by voice actress Tara Strong rather than Kunis. Strong, who is herself a legendary voice performer, slipped in and provided what the episode needed without calling attention to the substitution. Kunis did provide her own singing voice for the Road to the North Pole episode, which required a degree of musical performance from the character. The result is one of the more charming musical moments in the show's history, Kunis's voice having a natural quality that worked well in the context of the episode. The character of Meg represents something that the show's creators have described in various ways over the years. In the early seasons, she was conceived as the ordinary person in an extraordinary family, the human scale against which the show's absurdity could be measured. In later seasons, as the show's treatment of her darkened, she became something else, the focal point of a particular kind of comedy that many viewers found increasingly uncomfortable. But underneath all of that, in the DNA of the character, she is still that original conception. A teenager who just wants her family to pay attention to her. A girl who is trying to figure out who she is in a house that is not particularly conducive to that kind of self-discovery. Mila Kunis, who grew up speaking Ukrainian and Russian as her first languages and did not learn English until she arrived in Los Angeles at age 7, has given this character a particular quality of longing that might be hard to fully explain. She has talked about what it felt like to be the new kid, the different kid, the one who was not quite fitting in yet. Whether or not that experience informs Meg at a conscious level, there is something in the performance that rings true to anyone who has ever felt on the outside looking in. 3 voices, 3 women, 1 teenager perpetually stuck at 17. Section 7. Chris Griffin, The Buffalo Bill Revelation. Seth Green walked into his audition for the role of Chris Griffin and did a Buffalo Bill impression. Not a modified, family-friendly, somewhat palatable for a cartoon teenager version of Buffalo Bill. An actual Buffalo Bill impression, based on Ted Levine's performance as the deeply disturbing serial killer James Gumb in the 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs. If you have seen The Silence of the Lambs, you know exactly which character we are talking about. Buffalo Bill is the film's villain, a man who skins his victims and speaks in a distinctive, unsettling vocal pattern that Levine developed through careful character study. It is one of the most memorable villain voices in cinema history for reasons that are entirely connected to how deeply wrong it sounds. Seth Green, sitting in an audition room for a Fox animated comedy, reproduced that voice and then bent it sideways into something goofier, something that read as awkward and teenage and well-meaning rather than menacing. The producers, instead of asking security to escort him out, loved it. Green has told this story at various events and conventions over the years. At a Family Guy PaleyFest panel in 2024, celebrating the show's 25th anniversary, he described it again. The original pitch was just so weird that everyone liked it. And then over the years, the voice softened and evolved into what became familiar. A goofy, slightly dopey teenage voice with an underlying energy that somehow still has traces of that original Buffalo Bill weirdness if you listen for it. The origin of Chris Griffin's voice being a horror movie villain's impression that got domesticated into an animated teenager is one of the most absurd creative stories in the show's history. It is also, when you think about it, completely coherent. Buffalo Bill speaks in a way that is simultaneously strange and somehow earnest, completely committed to itself. And that quality is exactly what Chris Griffin's voice needed. The earnestness without the horror. For the original pilot pitch that Seth MacFarlane made to Fox with the $50,000 budget, MacFarlane himself voiced Chris. He gave the character a deeper tone, something more adult-sounding, which, if you go back and listen to the pilot, is noticeably different from the Chris that Seth Green eventually settled into. MacFarlane's version of Chris sounds like a teenager being voiced by someone who is slightly too old to be entirely convincing. Green's version sounds like an actual teenager who just happens to be speaking in a voice inspired by one of cinema's most unsettling villains. Chris Griffin's full name is Christopher Cross Griffin, a name that contains a direct reference to the soft rock musician Christopher Cross, who had several major hits in the early 1980s, including Sailing and Arthur's Theme. The naming is deliberate and the joke is quiet, the kind of thing you catch only if you know who Christopher Cross is, and if you know who Christopher Cross is, you probably enjoy this kind of layered reference. Chris is the middle child of the Griffin family, though the birth order arrangement has been described slightly differently at different points in the show's run. He is older than Stewie and younger than Meg. He attends James Woods Regional High School, which is named after the actor James Woods, who appeared in the show in a notable guest appearance in which he essentially played himself and spent time bonding with Peter Griffin in ways that escalated into genuine friendship before things went sideways. The school's naming is exactly the kind of thing Family Guy does when it is feeling playful. Naming the local high school after a celebrity guest who appeared in the show is a self-referential move that does not call too much attention to itself, but rewards the viewer who notices it. Chris is not the show's most complex character. That has never really been his role. Where Stewie gets the elaborate schemes, and Brian gets the existential crises, and Peter gets the disasters, and Meg gets the suffering, Chris gets to be the simple, good-natured one. He is kind without being wise. He is enthusiastic without being effective. He has a huge enthusiasm for art, specifically drawing, which he practices with genuine passion and moderate skill. His art is one of the more consistent character details across the show's long run. He draws. He cares about what he creates. In several episodes, his artwork is taken seriously enough by other characters to drive a plot. This gives Chris a genuine interest, something that belongs entirely to him and does not overlap with anyone else in the family's particular obsessions. He has a complicated relationship with food. Multiple episodes have addressed his eating habits and his self-consciousness about his weight, which mirrors his father's situation in some ways, but is played differently because Chris is a teenager still figuring himself out rather than an adult who has made peace with who he is. The show is more sympathetic to Chris's insecurities than it is to almost anything, which reflects the general comedic rule that targeting a teenager's self-image requires more delicacy than other kinds of comedy. He has a recurring relationship with a character named Neil Goldman, another student at James Woods Regional High School, who is deeply infatuated with Meg. Neil is also voiced by Seth Green, which meant for a period that Seth Green was in scenes where he was essentially talking to himself between two different teenage characters at the same school. Chris's relationship with his father is one of the warmer dynamics on the show in its early seasons. Peter genuinely enjoys Chris's company in a way that feels different from his interactions with his other children. There is something in the Chris and Peter pairing that works because they share an uncomplicated enthusiasm for things. Neither of them overcomplicates their relationship with the world, and when they are together, that shared simplicity creates genuine warmth. An evil monkey lives in Chris's closet. This is a running gag that appeared across several seasons and is exactly as described. A monkey who lives in Chris's bedroom closet and regularly points at him in a threatening manner. The monkey was eventually given a backstory in a later episode that played the whole thing surprisingly straight, revealing a creature with its own complicated history and emotional life. The monkey's origin as a gag was, like so many things on this show, a matter of someone in the writer's room thinking about what would be the most absurd thing a character like Chris would be too frightened to address and too embarrassed to tell anyone about. Seth Green's broader career runs parallel to his Family Guy work in ways that are worth noting. He is also the creator and primary puppeteer behind Robot Chicken, the stop-motion sketch comedy show on Adult Swim that has been running since 2005. Robot Chicken is in some ways the opposite of Family Guy in its comedic approach. Extremely fast, filled with pop culture references, built on stop-motion puppets rather than hand-drawn animation, but the shows have occasionally crossed paths, and the performers clearly have a shared sensibility about what animation can do that live action cannot. Green has also continued to work extensively in live action, with film and television roles that include the Austin Powers franchise, the It's Complicated movie with Meryl Streep, and a significant arc in the Netflix series That 90s Show, which is the revival of That 70s Show, and therefore connects him, by a very roundabout path, to Mila Kunis, who played Jackie Burkhart on the original show, and thus was already Meg Griffin when That 70s Show was at its peak. Chris Griffin's voice, the domesticated Buffalo Bill impression, has been in continuous production since 1999. In that time, it has evolved, softened at the edges, found its own rhythm distinct from its original inspiration. But if you know where to listen, if you have seen The Silence of the Lambs and paid attention to the specific quality of Ted Levine's performance as James Gumb, you can hear it in there. That original weirdness, buried now under 25 years of animated teenager, but still present if you go looking, it puts the lotion on its skin. No, wait, that is a different character. Chris Griffin would never say that, probably. Section 8. Glenn Quagmire, the man, the myth, the giggity. Quagmire's catchphrase was invented by accident. Not the giggity itself, not the specific word, but the whole phenomenon of it. Seth MacFarlane developed Quagmire's voice by listening to fast-talking radio disc jockeys from the 1950s, the kind of men who spoke at an elevated pace and with a particular slick enthusiasm that belonged entirely to a specific era of American entertainment. He has described Quagmire in his own words as a 50-year-old radio guy on coke, which is a very specific creative brief and also immediately clarifies a great deal about why the character sounds the way he does. The actual word giggity and the particular verbal tick of giggity giggity goo and its variations came from a staff writer named Steve Marmel doing a Jerry Lewis impression in the writer's room. Jerry Lewis had a particular physical and vocal comedy style, broad and slightly anarchic, and in his impression of Lewis, Marmel produced something that MacFarlane recognized as belonging to Quagmire. The word itself is not a Lewis catchphrase. It emerged from the shape of the impression, from what a fast-talking, exuberant mid-century entertainer's voice sounds like when it makes a particular sound. MacFarlane liked it. It went in the show. And it became one of the most recognized catchphrases in animated television history. Quagmire's full name is Glenn Quagmire, but this is not the name he was born with. The show revealed, in a Season 9 episode called Teagues for Two, that Quagmire was born Glenn Kwagelchek, a half-Polish last name that he changed at some point in his adult life to the name we know him by now. He was also, according to that same episode, obese as a child, which is the kind of character detail that the show drops in and then mostly never uses again, but that adds a particular layer to understanding why he evolved into the person he became. The name Quagmire was not invented by Seth MacFarlane. According to multiple accounts, including McFarlane's own, the name was suggested by a college acquaintance. The word itself has a genuine meaning. A quagmire is an area of soft, waterlogged ground that yields under your feet, or, metaphorically, a situation from which it is difficult to extricate yourself. The show has played with this meaning directly, in an episode actually titled Quagmire's Quagmire, which works on both levels. Bob Hope's face was part of the visual inspiration for Quagmire's character design. Hope, the comedian and entertainer who was enormously famous throughout the mid-20th century and remained culturally significant well into the era when Family Guy was created, had a particular kind of face that the animators found useful as a starting point. The specific chin, the angle of the jaw, something about the overall proportions of Hope's features found its way into the design of Quahog's most enthusiastic bachelor. Quagmire is described in the show's mythology as 61 years old, though this sits oddly against several other pieces of the character's history. His driver's license, seen in an episode called Foxy Lady, gives this age. He maintains his young appearance, the show explains, by consuming carrots, which is the kind of completely surreal explanation for a visual inconsistency that Family Guy has always been entirely comfortable offering. He is a former United States Navy ensign, which is where he first met Peter Griffin. This is part of the show's background mythology that is occasionally referenced and never fully explored, which is probably the right approach. The image of young Peter and young Quagmire together in the Navy raises more questions than it answers, and the show has wisely decided that some questions should remain open. He works as a commercial airline pilot, a job that fits perfectly with both his wanderlust and his ability to confidently take control of a situation. The show has done several episodes that center on his professional life and on the specific masculine competence that Quagmire brings to his work, which exists in sharp contrast to his personal life, where the word competence does not naturally arise. Every room in his house has a bed or some bed-adjacent piece of furniture hidden in it. This is a running visual gag that the animators have committed to with genuine dedication. If you pause on a shot of Quagmire's interior in almost any episode, you will find a fold-out couch or a Murphy bed or something that functions as additional sleeping space. His house is designed for a specific kind of hospitality that the show has always handled through implication rather than explicitness. His one genuine romantic love, the woman who the show treats as the true missed connection of his life, is a real person. Cheryl Tiegs, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit model, who was enormously famous in the 1970s and who has made a cameo appearance in the show. Quagmire's obsession with Tiegs has been treated as both a joke and a genuine emotional wound. The episode Tiegs for Two deals with it directly and gives Quagmire a moment of real vulnerability that is handled with more care than the character usually receives. The speech that Quagmire delivers to Brian in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black is one of the show's most talked-about character moments. In it, Quagmire lays out, with precision and genuine anger, everything he finds reprehensible about Brian Griffin. The detail in the speech, the specific examples he cites, the particular form his contempt takes, suggests that someone in the writer's room spent considerable time thinking about exactly what Quagmire would find most objectionable. What makes the speech interesting from a character perspective is not just its content but what it reveals about Quagmire. He has been paying attention. He has been watching Brian for years, noticing the gap between who Brian says he is and who Brian actually is, and at some point the accumulation of observations reached critical mass. The speech is not impulsive. It is the product of years of careful observation by someone who is, when he chooses to be, considerably more perceptive than his surface presentation suggests. Quagmire also has a genuine talent for music. He plays the saxophone, which is one of those character details that most people do not know because the show does not emphasize it. He has performed at various points in the series and has a natural musicality that connects, perhaps, to the mid-century entertainment world that McFarlane drew from when creating the character. The fast-talking radio DJs of the 1950s often worked in environments saturated with live music, and something of that musical sensibility found its way into Quagmire without ever becoming a central part of his identity. His relationship with his sister Brenda has been explored in a somewhat famous episode that deals with domestic abuse in a way that divided viewers considerably. The episode takes a comedic approach to a genuinely serious subject, which is the kind of thing Family Guy has always done, and that always generates discussion about whether the comedy serves or undermines the gravity of the subject. Whatever your view on that question, the episode revealed a side of Quagmire that is almost never visible: genuine protectiveness, deep family loyalty, and a willingness to act with real courage when someone he loves is being harmed. His father, revealed in a later season episode, went through a significant personal journey during the show's run. This storyline, which dealt with themes of gender identity in a way that was both progressive and somewhat chaotic, depending on your perspective, gave Quagmire a father-child relationship that complicated the character considerably and gave MacFarlane an opportunity to explore territory that animated comedies of the show's era rarely entered. The voice that MacFarlane created for Quagmire requires him to maintain a specific kind of vocal energy throughout every recording session. The rapid-fire delivery, the particular upbeat quality of the sound, the way certain phrases accelerate and then land, all of this is deliberate craft. MacFarlane has been doing this voice for more than 25 years, across hundreds of episodes, and it has remained consistent in ways that suggest he finds the character genuinely enjoyable to inhabit. Quagmire is described by MacFarlane as an appalling human being who is still caught in the Rat Pack era. That is the creative brief in its most condensed form. Everything else that Quagmire is, the pilot career, the saxophone talent, the genuine protectiveness of people he loves, the deep longing for Cheryl Tiegs, all of it exists inside that core description. He is a man from a particular era of American masculinity who has been deposited into a world that has moved on, and his response to that displacement is to double down on who he always was. That is, oddly, one of the more coherent character psychologies on the show. Giggity. Section 9. Joe Swanson and Cleveland Brown, the Pillars of Spooner Street. Patrick Warburton's voice is the reason Joe Swanson works as a character. This is not a controversial statement. It is almost universally agreed upon by people who think about the show and its cast. Warburton has one of the most recognizable voices in American entertainment, a deep, controlled baritone that carries an absolute authority regardless of what the words attached to it are actually saying. It is a voice that sounds like it belongs to the most competent person in any room. Joe Swanson is, within the show's mythology, one of the most physically capable people in Quahog. He is a police officer. He has won multiple awards for athletic performance. He has demonstrated, across many episodes, the ability to overpower virtually any opponent in hand-to-hand combat. He is, arguably, the best fighter in the show's regular cast. He can do this while being paralyzed from the waist down. The paralysis was established in the very first episode in which Joe appeared, a Season 1 episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, which is also the episode that introduces him to the Griffin's neighborhood. The story he tells about how he became paralyzed involves an orphanage, a robbery, and a confrontation with the Grinch on Christmas Eve. He was chasing the Grinch across a rooftop when he slipped on a roller skate and fell, severing his spinal cord. The Grinch. He fell off a roof while chasing the Grinch. The show played this completely straight. There was no joke about the absurdity of the Grinch being a real person in this universe. Joe told the story with the full emotional weight of someone describing the moment their life changed forever, and Warburton delivered it in a way that made you feel the enormity of it even while the content was surreal. That combination of completely sincere performance and completely absurd subject matter is one of the tricks that Family Guy does well when it is doing it well. The official story of Joe's paralysis changed in a later episode, by the way. The show revealed that the Grinch story was something Joe told to make a better narrative, and that the real way he became paralyzed involved a drug investigation and a man named Bobby Briggs. This kind of retroactive story change is something the show has never been particularly bothered by, treating continuity as a loose suggestion rather than a binding obligation. Warburton is best known outside of Family Guy for two other roles that reveal a great deal about his particular abilities as a performer. He played David Puddy on Seinfeld, the recurring boyfriend of Elaine Bennies who had his own bizarre internal logic and who became a fan favorite through his complete seriousness about everything. He voiced Kronk in The Emperor's New Groove, the Disney animated film in which he plays a cheerfully good-natured henchman who is perhaps the most beloved character in a film full of excellent characters. Both of those performances, like Joe Swanson, depend on the same quality. Warburton commits fully to what his character believes. Putty does not know he is a punchline. Kronk does not know he is supposed to be a villain's incompetent sidekick. Joe does not know that the combination of his absolute seriousness and his completely absurd situation is funny. The comedy comes from the conviction, not from any awareness of the comedy. Joe and Bonnie, his wife, have a daughter named Susie and a son named Kevin. Susie is a baby who, in one of the show's smaller recurring jokes, has an extremely deep adult voice when she speaks in her head. Kevin went missing for several seasons of the show and was eventually explained away in a later episode that handled his absence in a characteristically Family Guy fashion, which is to say, it was acknowledged and then quickly moved past. Bonnie Swanson, voiced by Jennifer Tilly, was pregnant for an extraordinary amount of time relative to the show's internal timeline. She was visibly pregnant for multiple seasons before actually giving birth to Susie in an episode called Ocean's 3.5. The pregnancy lasted significantly longer than 9 months in real-time viewer experience, which the show was aware of and made occasional jokes about. Cleveland Brown is a different kind of character from the rest of the Spooner Street ensemble, and not just because his spin-off, The Cleveland Show, gave him an extended solo presence that none of the other supporting characters ever received. Cleveland is Peter's friend who runs a deli. His voice is slow and measured, which the show explained in a detail that most people do not know. Cleveland used to be an accomplished auctioneer. That career ended when he was struck in the head by a totem pole, which permanently altered the speed of his speech. He went from being someone whose professional identity was built on rapid delivery to someone who speaks in a deliberate, unhurried way that functions as his most recognizable trait. He is voiced by Mike Henry, a Family Guy writer and producer who also voiced several other recurring characters on the show. Henry provided Cleveland's voice from the show's premiere in 1999 through season 19. In 2020, Henry announced that he was stepping down from voicing Cleveland, stating that he felt it was more respectful and appropriate for a black character to be voiced by a black actor. The role was taken over by Arif Zahir, a comedian and voice actor who had built a following online partially through Family Guy-related content and impressions. Zahir's transition into the official role was handled smoothly, and he has continued to develop the character in the seasons since his arrival. Cleveland's spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, ran for 4 seasons from 2009 through 2013 on Fox. It followed Cleveland after he left Quahog following his divorce from his first wife Loretta, moved to Stoolbend, Virginia, and built a new family with Donna Tubbs, the mother of 2 children named Roberta and Rallo. The spin-off expanded Cleveland's world considerably and gave him storylines and relationships that the ensemble format of Family Guy could never have provided. When The Cleveland Show ended, Cleveland returned to Family Guy and to Spooner Street, his absence acknowledged in the show by having him simply walk back into the bar and sit down as though not much time had passed. The original Cleveland, the one from the early seasons of Family Guy, was written with a specific kind of dignity that distinguished him from the more cartoonishly exaggerated members of the ensemble. Cleveland was the calm one, the thoughtful one, the voice in the group that occasionally said the thing that actually made sense. His slowness of speech was not a slowness of thought, and the show made that distinction clearly when it needed to. Joe and Cleveland together represent something that the show uses well in its best episodes. A version of masculinity that includes genuine friendship without needing to explain or analyze itself. When Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire are all at the bar together, there is a kind of easy warmth in the dynamic. 4 very different men who have found something in each other's company that they value without being able to necessarily name it. The bar itself, the Drunken Clam, is one of the show's most consistent physical locations. It has been the site of some of the show's best dialogue and some of its worst decisions, and many of the moments in between. Horace, the barman, is one of those supporting characters who is always present and rarely centered, the kind of face you see in every episode of a show set in a bar and that becomes, over time, almost as familiar as the main cast. Joe Swanson plays racquetball. This is a fact that the show has mentioned in passing and that has never been developed into a major plot point, but that sits there in the background of the character's mythology as a very specific detail. A wheelchair-using police officer who competes in racquetball is doing something genuinely athletic and genuinely challenging, and the show's casual reference to it without drawing attention to it is actually a nice piece of characterization. The Spooner Street neighbors have a particular geography in the show. Peter and Lois are at 31. Joe is at 33. Quagmire is somewhere nearby. The Swanson house's proximity to the Griffin house means that Joe is often the first person to arrive when something explodes, or a siren sounds, or Peter needs help with something that has clearly already gone wrong. Warburton has, over more than 2 decades of recording Joe Swanson, given the character a remarkable consistency. The voice is exactly what you remember from the very first episode. The specific quality of authoritative delivery combined with absolute seriousness has never wavered. Joe knows who he is. He has always known who he is. And Patrick Warburton has never let him be anyone else. Section 10. The World They Live In. Spooner Street Secrets. The fictional city of Quahog, Rhode Island, has a real address in the real state of Rhode Island, which does not contain a city called Quahog. Quahog is modeled on Cranston, the second largest city in Rhode Island, located just south of Providence. The visual landscape of the show, the mid-scale houses, the neighborhood bars, the particular kind of working-class New England urban texture comes from the kind of observation that McFarlane, who studied at RISD in Providence, had ample opportunity to conduct. Rhode Island is an unusual choice for an animated show setting. Most animated comedies set in a specific American location choose somewhere instantly recognizable, New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or the Midwest. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the Union by land area. Its largest city, Providence, has a population of about 200,000 people, which makes it mid-sized by national standards and very significant by New England standards. What Rhode Island has culturally is a specific identity. It is the only New England state with significant Italian-American and Irish-American communities that have maintained distinct neighborhood identities into the modern era. It has a working-class Catholic tradition that sits alongside an elite intellectual culture centered around Brown University and RISD itself. It has its own accent, sometimes called the Rhode Island or Providence accent, that is distinct from the Boston accent people outside the region tend to conflate it with. All of this is in Family Guy's DNA. Peter's Irish Catholic working-class identity is Rhode Island specific. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery is named after Pawtucket, a real city just north of Providence and home to the minor league baseball team that shares the actual Pawtucket name. The general social texture of the show, the bar culture, the blue-collar pride, the specific relationship to Boston as a larger neighboring city, all of this comes from a place the show has understood from the beginning. The street name Spooner Street is not a reference to anything in particular. It is a name that sounds like a real American street name without calling attention to itself, which is exactly what it needed to be. The Griffin family home at 31 Spooner Street has been described consistently across the show's run, though the interior layout has shifted somewhat between seasons as different animation teams handled different episodes. The exterior is the more stable element. A beige house with a peaked roof and a red door, and a driveway that has been the site of more incidents than any single residential driveway should reasonably sustain. Stewie's bedroom is upstairs, and is consistently described as containing, at various points in the show's history, a time machine, a hyperspace bypass, multiple weapons of various sophistication, and a teddy bear who functions as his most trusted confidant. The bedroom functions as a laboratory and a villain's lair and a baby's room all at once, and the show trusts viewers to accept this without explanation. Brian's space in the house is slightly ambiguous. He has a dog bed. He has a food bowl. He also has a coffee table where he works on his novel, a liquor cabinet he has claimed a portion of, and a social position in the family that is closer to roommate than to pet. The neighborhood's recurring background characters are worth cataloging briefly, because some of them have become genuinely beloved by audiences over the show's long run. Mort Goldman runs the pharmacy on the show's version of the main commercial street. He is Jewish, neurotic, frequently fearful, and has been used as the vehicle for some of the show's more overtly religious humor, both complimentary and uncomfortable depending on which episode you are watching. His son Neil, also voiced by Seth Green, is the teenager who maintains an unrequited obsession with Meg throughout the show's high school years. Herbert is one of the show's most controversial recurring characters. He is an elderly man who lives in the neighborhood and whose interest in young boys is treated as a running joke that the show deploys with varying degrees of discomfort across its run. The character is the subject of genuine debate about where the line is between using dark subject matter for comedy and normalizing something that should not be normalized. Different viewers have come to different conclusions, and the show has never quite fully reckoned with the tension in the character. Bonnie Swanson's extended pregnancy, already mentioned in Joe's section, is one of the neighborhood's most extended running jokes. She was pregnant for so many seasons that fans developed genuine affection for the ongoing gag, and the eventual birth of Susie became a genuinely anticipated moment rather than just a plot resolution. The drunken clam is Family Guy's Cheers, which is an obvious comparison but also the accurate one. It is the place where the male characters of the show congregate when they need to process, celebrate, commiserate, or simply exist in each other's company without having to explain themselves to their families. Horace runs it with the patient efficiency of someone who has heard everything and forgotten most of it for professional reasons. The show's world has specific rules that are never quite made explicit but that the audience absorbs through repeated exposure. One of those rules is that continuity is flexible. Characters age without aging, events happen and are forgotten. Major consequences of major episodes do not carry forward. The show exists in a permanent present tense where each episode is, in a sense, the first episode, and the history that has accumulated across 25 years of production is more like a shared mythology than a linear narrative. This is different from shows like The Simpsons, which has a similar non-aging situation but treats it somewhat differently, and from shows like South Park, which has experimented with serialization more explicitly. Family Guy's relationship to its own continuity is casual and deliberate at the same time. The show knows that these contradictions exist. It makes jokes about them, and then it continues. Another world-building detail that most viewers have never noticed is the specific way the show handles other media within its universe. The Griffins watch television. They watch movies. The shows they watch are often real programs, real actors, real cultural artifacts, which creates an unusual situation where the characters in this fictional world appear to share a pop culture history with the viewer while still being in a fictional Rhode Island neighborhood. This creates occasional logical wrinkles. If Family Guy exists as a television show in the real world, do the Griffins know about Family Guy? The show has occasionally played with this question in self-referential ways that reveal an awareness of the paradox without resolving it. Adam West appears in the show as the mayor of Quahog, playing a fictionalized version of himself. West, who died in 2017, was an actor best known for his portrayal of Batman in the 1960s television series of the same name. His appearance on Family Guy as the mayor gave the character a very specific kind of detached eccentricity that West committed to fully, and the recurring mayor became one of the most beloved supporting characters in the show, precisely because West seemed to understand exactly what the joke was and was fully in on it. His death in 2017 prompted one of the show's more genuine moments of mourning. The show did an episode that addressed the mayor's death with more sincerity than most animated comedies would have brought to the passing of a recurring character. West had been part of the show's world for long enough that his absence was genuinely felt. The broader Quahog universe extends to television personalities within the show's world. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, later replaced by Joyce Kinney, anchor the local news channel. Tom Tucker, voiced by Seth MacFarlane using his easy, natural voice, has a son named Jake Tucker whose head is upside down, which is played completely straight across every episode in which Jake appears. Nobody addresses the upside-down head as unusual. It simply is the shape of Jake Tucker's head, and the world has adapted to this. These kinds of background details, the small world-building choices that never get explained or justified, are part of what gives the show's world its particular texture. It is a place where a baby can build a time machine, and nobody comments on it. Where a talking dog is simply a family member. Where the mayor of the city once played Batman on television. These things are all true at once, and somehow the world holds them without strain. Section 11. Seth MacFarlane, the man who voices them all. Seth MacFarlane almost was not on the planet to create Family Guy. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of the 11th of September, 2001. Boston's Logan Airport, departing at 7:59 a.m. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time. He arrived at the gate after boarding had closed. He had also, by his own account, been out late the night before and was not at peak operational efficiency that particular morning. Flight 11 was the first plane hijacked that morning. At 8:46 a.m., it was flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. This is a piece of real history. It happened. And it happened to a person who, at the time, was already the creator and primary voice of one of Fox's newest animated comedies, a show called Family Guy that was only 2 years into its original run and had not yet been canceled the first time. The world knows this story because MacFarlane has talked about it, and because it is the kind of story that is both undeniably true and almost impossible to fully absorb. He has been asked about it in interviews. His answers are measured and thoughtful and do not lean into drama about it, which seems consistent with who he is as a person. He survived by accident. He is aware of that. He has not made it the center of his public identity, but he also has not pretended it did not happen. This is the background against which everything else about Seth MacFarlane needs to be understood. The show he built, the characters he voices, the world he created in his kitchen with $50,000 and 6 months of no sleep, all of it almost did not continue past a Tuesday morning in September 2001. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut. He grew up in a household where both parents were teachers, which perhaps explains something about his relationship to research and detail. The way his comedy tends to be built on specific references rather than general impressions, he started drawing cartoons at age 2. He was showing genuine artistic ability by age 9, when a local newspaper in Connecticut began running his cartoon strips. He attended the Rhode Island School of Design, graduating in 1995. RISD is one of the most prestigious art and design schools in the country, and its presence in Providence is part of why Rhode Island has a richer cultural life than its small size might suggest. MacFarlane was studying animation, and his thesis project was the short film called The Life of Larry that eventually became the prototype for Family Guy. His professor at RISD submitted that film to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for characters like Fred Flintstone and Yogi Bear and Scooby-Doo, among many others. Hanna-Barbera liked what they saw and hired the young graduate, which is an extraordinary outcome for a thesis film submitted by a professor without the student's foreknowledge. MacFarlane suddenly had a job in professional animation before the ink on his diploma had dried. He worked at Hanna-Barbera, which by the mid-1990s had become Cartoon Network Studios, on several shows including Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He has described the writing work on those shows as valuable training in storytelling structure, in understanding how animated comedy works at a technical level. Even if the shows themselves were very different from what he would eventually create, the craft he developed there went directly into Family Guy. His voice work is one of the most astonishing things about his contribution to the show. He voices Peter Griffin, whose Rhode Island working-class timbre required specific calibration. He voices Brian Griffin, for whom he uses his own natural voice. He voices Stewie Griffin, the Rex Harrison falsetto that has to be maintained consistently. He voices Glenn Quagmire, the 1950s radio DJ energy that requires a specific vocal pace. And beyond those 4 main characters, he voices dozens of recurring and background characters across the show's run, including Carter Pewterschmidt and Tom Tucker and various others. That is an extraordinary amount of vocal work per episode, per season, across what is now more than 25 years of production. Voice recording sessions for animated shows require actors to come in and record their lines independently, not with other actors in the room simultaneously, which means MacFarlane is often doing all 4 of his character voices in rapid succession in a recording booth. Switching between Peter's bluster and Brian's calm and Stewie's menace and Quagmire's enthusiasm, he has said that the easiest of his characters to voice is actually Tom Tucker, the anchorman, for whom he uses a voice very close to his natural register. The most demanding is probably Peter, whose specific combination of accent and timing requires the most active performance. The $50,000 budget story is worth staying with for a moment because it says something important about creative necessity. Most animated pilot pitches in that era cost somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million just to produce at a professional level. MacFarlane was given 5% of the lower end of that range and told to make something good enough to convince network executives to bet real money on. What he produced in 6 months, largely alone in his kitchen, was rough by the standards of professional animation. He has acknowledged this himself, describing the finished pilot as very, very simply, crudely animated, with just enough to get the tone of the show across. But tone is everything in a comedy. If the tone is right, if the sensibility is clear, if you can feel the specific kind of funny this show wants to be, then the roughness of the animation is not an obstacle. It is just a detail that money will eventually fix. Fox ordered the series immediately after seeing the pilot. The executives, Gary Newman and Dana Walden, recognized what they were looking at. They had already seen what King of the Hill could do. They knew there was an audience for animated adult comedy that was not The Simpsons. MacFarlane was offering them something different from both Groening and Judge, something with its own sensibility and its own rhythm. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999, following the Super Bowl. That premiere slot was worth more than any marketing campaign. It gave Family Guy an audience of 22 million people for its first episode, people who had not sought it out but found themselves watching it because the football game had just ended and the remote control was across the room. MacFarlane's political views are part of the show's background context. He is openly liberal, a supporter of progressive causes, and has been since before Family Guy was produced. His frustrations with Fox as a network, connected to its association with a particular political media world, have been public and on the record. He posted on social media in 2021 saying he wished Family Guy were on any other network, comparing the relationship to a failing marriage. He signed a deal with NBC Universal in 2020 that moved his production company away from the Fox ecosystem for his other work. The tension between the creator and the network that airs his show is one of the stranger ongoing stories in television. Family Guy exists on Fox. MacFarlane's newer projects do not. The show continues because the economics work for everyone involved. MacFarlane voices the characters because that is what his contract requires. The show exists in this peculiar space where the person who built it has not quite left it, but is no longer fully present in it, which is a complicated situation for any creative work. He signed a deal in 2020 with NBC Universal worth a reported $200 million over 5 years. That deal covered his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, and his newer projects, none of which involve Fox. The Orville, his science fiction series, was produced first for Fox and then moved to Hulu. The Ted prequel series he produced ran on Peacock, another NBC Universal property. MacFarlane has been building a second creative life with different partners. While Family Guy continues to run on the network, he has publicly said he wishes he were not attached to. The April 2025 announcement of a deal extending Family Guy through season 27, taking the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, and coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary, confirmed that the economics will keep this show running regardless of the creative or relational complications surrounding it. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The show that debuted with a $50,000 pilot budget in a young man's kitchen in Connecticut is now guaranteed to continue through 3 more decades of existence. The man who built it from nothing sleeps somewhere in Los Angeles, surrounded by his other projects, still coming in to voice 4 characters for a show on a network he would prefer not to be on, having by accident survived a morning that killed 2,977 other people. That is a very specific and very strange life. And Family Guy, with all its wildness and its warmth and its occasional cruelty, is the artifact that life produced. Section 12. Legacy, Records, and Facts You Never Knew. Family Guy was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009. That single fact, when you understand its context, tells you more about the show's peak creative reputation than almost anything else could. The Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series is the most prestigious award in American television comedy. It has been won by programs like Frasier, Seinfeld, Cheers, The Office, and 30 Rock. The nominees in any given year represent what the television industry considers the best comedy being made. In 2009, Family Guy was in that category. More specifically, it was the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones was nominated in 1961, 48 years. The Emmy voters had not looked at an animated comedy and decided it belonged in the Outstanding Comedy category since the Kennedy administration. And then Family Guy, the show that Fox had canceled twice and that came back from the dead through DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, walked into that category and sat down. The show did not win. The award went to 30 Rock that year, a choice that very few people would argue with given the quality of that show in that period. But the nomination itself was a statement. It said that the television industry recognized Family Guy as something more than a successful commercial product. It was, at that moment in its history, genuinely excellent television. TV Guide ranked it ninth among the greatest television cartoons of all time in 2013. That is a list with The Simpsons and Looney Tunes and Peanuts and other programs that have been culturally central for generations. Being ninth on that list is not an embarrassment. It is a genuine achievement. The show has been canceled twice and revived twice. The first cancellation came after 3 seasons in 2002. The circumstances around this have been described in detail elsewhere in this script, but what is worth emphasizing here is that the cancellation was widely understood at the time to be the result of scheduling mismanagement by Fox rather than creative failure. Fox moved the show from time slot to time slot during its original run, never giving it a consistent home or enough consecutive weeks in any single position for an audience to find it and form the habit of watching it. They put it on Thursday nights opposite Frasier on NBC. Then they moved it to Tuesday nights opposite Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Neither of those was a position where a new animated show could grow its audience in the early 2000s, before streaming and DVRs changed how television works. The revival story is genuinely one of the most remarkable in the history of American television. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air Family Guy reruns on their Adult Swim late-night programming block in 2003, getting those rights at a bargain price because nobody thought a canceled show was worth much. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim in April 2003 and immediately became the highest-rated program on the entire block. The Adult Swim numbers were extraordinary. The reruns boosted the block's overall viewership by 239% in some reporting periods. This was a program that Fox had thrown away, becoming, essentially overnight, the most-watched thing on late-night cable television. Simultaneously, the DVD releases of the show's first and second seasons sold over 400,000 copies, which was a huge number for a canceled cartoon, and which demonstrated something important about the audience the show had built. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show. They were telling their friends about it. They were creating word of mouth in an era before social media existed to carry that kind of enthusiasm. Fox noticed. By 2004, they had made the decision to bring the show back. A 4th season was ordered. The show that had been written off, stripped of its writers, scattered across the industry, came back from cancellation for the second time. The statistics around the show's viewership over its full run tell a specific story that is both impressive and somewhat melancholy. The premiere drew 22 million viewers on the Super Bowl boost. The first season averaged 12.8 million households. After the revival, Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers. Season 13 averaged about 5.86 million. By Season 20, the average was approximately 1.3 million. Season 23 saw numbers around 723,000. The decline in linear television viewership is real and affects every show that has run long enough to span the streaming transition. The audience for Family Guy did not disappear. It fragmented, spread across streaming platforms and DVR playback and international distribution. The show's actual cultural presence is larger than its live television numbers in any single week would suggest. Hulu streams the show. Adult Swim airs it in reruns. FXX has it in syndication. The show generates merchandise income from products that have been selling for more than 20 years. The total audience for Family Guy, measured across all platforms and distribution channels, is almost certainly still enormous. The 2025 renewal deal, extending the show through Season 27 and through the 2028 to 2029 television season, confirmed what everyone in the industry already knew. The show will continue as long as it continues to generate money, and it will continue to generate money for a very long time, regardless of what happens to its ratings on any particular Wednesday night. The move from Sunday to Wednesday nights, which happened for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, was the first time the show had aired on a weekday since its troubled early run in 2002. This was widely understood as a sign that Fox no longer considered it a flagship program for their prime Sunday animation lineup. But the show continued. It always continues. Some facts that did not fit elsewhere in this script. The original pilot pitch from MacFarlane was completed and delivered to Fox on the 15th of May, 1998, a date that several sources confirm precisely because it was the day the Griffin family first appeared on screen. The show's theme song, the Griffin family singing around the piano, in a sequence that has opened every episode since the premiere, is a gentle parody of All in the Family and its tradition of animated sitcoms having opening musical numbers. The song includes the line, "It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV," which is exactly the kind of complaint you might hear from someone who disapproves of Family Guy, delivered by the characters of Family Guy as though it were a reasonable observation. Seth MacFarlane has won several Annie Awards, which are the animation industry's equivalent of the Emmys, for his work on the show. The Parents Television Council has consistently ranked Family Guy among the worst programs on primetime television since its earliest seasons. They placed it on their worst shows list in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The FCC received multiple complaints and formal petitions asking that the show be blocked from broadcasting. MacFarlane's response to this has generally been to note that the show continues to exist and that this seems like a reasonable verdict on the arguments being made against it. Carol Burnett filed a lawsuit against the show in 2007, related to a scene that used her character, the Charwoman, in a context she objected to. The courts ruled in favor of the show on First Amendment grounds. The lawsuit itself generated more attention than the episode that prompted it. The show's connection to pop culture has been mutual and ongoing. Other shows reference Family Guy. Family Guy references everything else. South Park dedicated 2 episodes to satirizing the show's writing process, depicting it as random joke generation by manatees pushing idea balls together. Matt Stone and Trey Parker have been public about their view of Family Guy's writing, and the response from the Family Guy side was equally public, and the whole exchange became a documented piece of animation history. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, has told the Buffalo Bill story about the voice at multiple events and in multiple formats over the years, which suggests it is one of those creative origin stories that people keep asking him about because they find it as surprising and entertaining each time as the first time they heard it. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, appeared in the 2012 film Ted, Seth MacFarlane's live-action comedy, in a small role. The film was set in Boston, not far from the show's fictional Rhode Island setting, and starred Mark Wahlberg as a man whose childhood teddy bear came to life. The film made over $500 million worldwide, making it one of the most successful rated comedies ever produced. The Boston connection, the New England setting, the Family Guy creator and cast member appearing in it, all of it creates a small cultural cluster around a specific region of the country that MacFarlane has clearly spent his career processing. Mila Kunis has been Meg Griffin for over 25 years, longer than she has held almost any other role in her career. She has said that the work is easy to schedule because it does not require her to be anywhere in particular, just in a recording booth for a few hours at a time. The contrast between the size of her film and television career and the relatively quiet regularity of voicing Meg in a booth is one of those professional contradictions that make the entertainment industry interesting. The time that passes in these recording sessions, year after year, season after season, is invisible in the finished product. Stewie is always 1 year old. Peter is always 42 or so. Brian is always however old a dog is when he is essentially a man in all practical senses. The world of Quahog does not age, even as the people creating it do. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when Family Guy first aired. He is in his early 50s now. Peter Griffin was probably supposed to be somewhere in his late 30s, and he still is, because that is how the show works. 25 years of the same characters in the same neighborhood. 25 years of Peter getting into something and Brian looking at him with patient exasperation, and Stewie plotting something in his bedroom, and Lois sighing in a way that contains multitudes, and Meg standing in the corner, wanting someone to notice her, and Chris wandering in with an energy that is at some irreducible level still haunted by the memory of Buffalo Bill's voice. The show that was built for $50,000 in a kitchen in Connecticut has made more money than any amount of money that sentence can adequately convey. It has been watched in how many countries? It has been translated into how many languages? It has generated quotes that are reproduced online every day by people who do not always know where they come from. It almost did not happen. Then it happened and got canceled. Then it came back and got canceled again. Then it came back again and has been going ever since, steadily, season by season, Through everything that has changed in the world and everything that has changed in television and everything that has changed in the lives of the people who make it. The Griffins are still on Spooner Street. The Drunken Clam is still open. Quagmire is still in the house next door with the hidden beds. Joe is in the driveway, ready to drive somewhere in the most capable manner possible. Cleveland is back from stool bend and at his usual stool. And somewhere in the Griffin house, a baby in a white shirt and red overalls is sitting in his crib with his teddy bear Rupert, speaking in an accent that is not his real accent, thinking thoughts that no baby should have, building something that will definitely require a safety warning and probably an evacuation radius. He is still there. After all this time, he is still there. Closing. Thank you for spending the night with us. That is everything for tonight. 25 years of characters, facts, voices, origins, and the small, strange history of a show that should not exist but does, and has, for longer now than most of the people who watch it have been alive. If any of these facts surprised you, if you had no idea that Stewie's accent was an invention of the character's own psychology, or that Chris Griffin's voice came from the most disturbing corner of 1990s cinema, or that 3 different women spoke before Mila Kunis became the definitive sound of Meg Griffin, or that Seth MacFarlane built the whole thing in his kitchen for $50,000, then this was worth the time we spent together. You can sleep now. The night is quiet and you are comfortable, and the Griffins are all still in their house on Spooner Street doing whatever it is they do when nobody is writing episodes about them. Probably something inadvisable. If this video helped you drift off or relax or just gave you something soft and interesting to listen to in the dark, it would mean a great deal if you left a like before you fall asleep. Subscribe if you want more of these long, slow, fact-filled nights. The comments are always open if you want to talk about something you heard, or something you already knew, or something we missed. We will be back soon. Sleep well. End of script. Section 13. The Voices Behind the Voices, Recording Sessions and Forgotten Facts. The recording booth for Family Guy is one of the more unusual workplaces in American entertainment, and understanding what happens in it changes how you hear the show. Most animated television series record their voice actors separately rather than together. The actors come in on different days, sometimes weeks apart, and deliver their lines to a microphone and a script without their scene partners present. The editor and sound team later assemble these isolated performances into something that sounds like a conversation. The energy of the scene, the timing, the rhythm of dialogue, all of that has to be constructed artificially from recordings made in isolation. Family Guy operates largely this way, which makes Seth MacFarlane's ability to maintain distinct and consistent voices for 4 very different characters across every recording session, a particularly impressive piece of sustained discipline. He is not playing off another performer when he voices Peter. He is delivering a line into a microphone alone in a booth, trusting that the editing will place it correctly within the scene. And then, sometimes in the same session, he has to switch completely and deliver lines as Brian, or Stewie, or Quagmire, each voice requiring its own specific physical production, its own particular place in his range and his body. Voice actors talk about placing a voice, meaning finding the physical location in the throat and chest where a particular sound originates. Peter's voice lives in a different place than Brian's. Stewie's voice requires a specific engagement of the head resonance that Peter's does not. Quagmire's rapid-fire delivery demands a different relationship to the breath than the measured, dry delivery of Brian. MacFarlane has been doing this for over 25 years. The consistency across that span is something that gets taken for granted by viewers because the characters always sound like themselves, and a sound that never changes stops registering as a technical achievement. Alex Borstein's process with Lois requires the same kind of sustained commitment. She has been producing that specific voice, the long-voweled, slightly nasal Long Island Hungarian blend that she developed from her cousin for every episode since the show's premiere. The cousin herself presumably goes about her life in New York without particularly thinking about the fact that her voice has been on television continuously for over a quarter century. Seth Green's voice for Chris has evolved slightly over the 25-year run, the edges of the Buffalo Bill influence softening and something more natural growing up underneath it. If you listen to Chris in Season 1 and then listen to Chris in Season 23, the voice is recognizably the same character, but the specific quality of it has changed, matured, found its own center of gravity independent of its unusual origin. Mila Kunis has spoken publicly about the physical experience of voicing Meg. The character is frequently distressed, frequently resigned, frequently trying to contain large emotions with a fairly flat vocal delivery. Kunis has said that she comes into the booth and relatively quickly finds the emotional register that Meg inhabits, which is perhaps not surprising given that she has been doing it for over 20 years, and the character's emotional state tends to be consistent enough that no new calibration is required. Patrick Warburton for Joe requires the voice but also the conviction. Joe speaks with authority about everything, whether he is describing a police procedure or recommending a bar snack. Warburton's particular gift is making that authority feel completely natural rather than performed, which means every line Joe delivers carries the weight of someone who genuinely believes what he is saying, which is funnier than it would be if the character were playing for laughs. The writer's room for Family Guy has, over the show's run, employed hundreds of different writers at various points, some staying for many seasons and some coming and going after a season or two. The core creative staff has remained relatively stable across the show's post-revival run, centered around showrunners who took on increasing responsibility as MacFarlane's direct involvement in the writing decreased. One aspect of the writing process that Family Guy fans often ask about is the ratio of characters and jokes. The show famously produces more jokes per episode than most animated comedies, and many of those jokes are not connected to the main plot. They exist to fill the space between narrative moments, which means the writing room is constantly generating material that never becomes a story in the traditional sense. A joke about Peter's neighbor's car, a cutaway about a historical figure, a Quagmire comment that lands in 2 seconds and then the episode moves on. This kind of joke production requires a particular kind of creative metabolism, a high rate of idea generation with less emphasis on any single idea being developed into something bigger. Writers' rooms for shows like this tend to develop a specific muscle for rapid ideation, for finding the funny angle on anything quickly and moving on, that is different from the muscle required to develop a 22-minute story with emotional beats and character growth. The balance between those two things, the quick joke and the sustained story, is where Family Guy has always existed. At its best, both muscles are engaged simultaneously. At other points in its history, one has been stronger than the other. One production fact that very few people know is that Family Guy has been animated by several different studios across its run. The original 3 seasons were handled by Rough Draft Studios, a company based in Los Angeles and Seoul that has animated some of the most beloved American cartoons of the last 30 years, including Futurama. Fans with a strong enough visual memory of the early seasons will recognize the particular quality of Rough Draft's work, an expressiveness of character movement, and a looseness in the animation that gave the early episodes a specific energy. After the revival in Season 4, the animation changed. Different studios handled different seasons. The transition from one animation house to another is visible if you know to look for it, in the thickness of the outlines, the fluidity of movement, the expressiveness of facial reactions. Later seasons have what the animation community sometimes calls a smoother, more polished look that has simultaneously lost some of the handmade energy of the early work. This is not a criticism necessarily. Smoother animation is not worse animation in any absolute sense, but it is different, and the difference registers when you compare episodes across the show's history. Section 14. The Cultural Footprint. How Family Guy Changed Everything. Family Guy premiered in 1999, and by 2005 it had changed the grammar of American animated comedy in ways that most people who watch television have absorbed without consciously noticing. The cutaway gag, which the show did not invent but which it used with a consistency and volume that nobody had previously attempted, became the dominant comedic form of a specific era of internet culture. The structure of a Family Guy cutaway is almost perfectly suited to the short-form video sharing that YouTube made possible starting in 2005, which is the same year the show came back from its first cancellation. A cutaway is a self-contained comedy unit. It has a setup, implicit in the line that introduces it. It has a joke. It has an end. It is portable. It can be understood by someone who has never seen the show. The years between roughly 2005 and 2012, when Family Guy was at its peak influence on popular culture, produced a specific style of internet humor that people who grew up during that period still recognize immediately. It was random but structured. It was dark but friendly. It built jokes through juxtaposition rather than through logic. It trusted the audience to make connections without explaining them. This style became so widespread that it influenced how people wrote and spoke online, in comments sections, and on message boards, and in the early days of social media. The Family Guy grammar became a kind of shorthand for a generation of internet users who had spent their formative years watching Peter Griffin transition into a cutaway about a chicken fajita or a Renaissance night or some other element of early 2000s American culture. The show's relationship to popular culture was always reciprocal. It absorbed enormous amounts of specific cultural material and reflected it back transformed by its own sensibility. References to films, television shows, musicians, historical figures, public events, all of it went into the show and came out as Family Guy jokes, which are a specific kind of thing distinct from simply referencing something. A Family Guy joke about a thing is not commentary on that thing. It is the thing being used as raw material for something that is specifically and only funny in the context of this show. South Park, the other long-running adult animated comedy that has always existed in productive tension with Family Guy, made its criticism of this approach explicit in the 2006 two-episode arc Cartoon Wars. In those episodes, South Park depicted Family Guy's creative process as manatees in a tank, randomly selecting plastic balls with words on them, each ball representing an element that gets combined with others to produce the show's jokes. The implication was that the jokes are random and therefore require no real creative skill. Matt Stone and Trey Parker, South Park's creators, have confirmed that this was an intentional critique rather than just a parody. They genuinely believed that Family Guy's approach to comedy was less rigorous than South Park's, and they were willing to make a two-episode statement about it. The fact that Stone and Parker received calls afterward from writers on The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanking them for the episodes suggests the criticism resonated within the animation community. Family Guy's own response was to make jokes about the South Park criticism, which is characteristic of how the show handles almost everything uncomfortable. Rather than engaging seriously with the argument, it absorbed it into its own self-referential machinery and turned it into another layer of meta-comedy. Whether this response was satisfying depends entirely on what you were looking for. The show's influence on comedy at large extends beyond the cutaway structure. Its willingness to treat almost any subject as available for comedy, to reach into territory that other shows would not approach, pushed the limits of what broadcast television could include in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Parents Television Council's repeated placement of Family Guy at the top of its worst shows lists was, in practice, excellent publicity for a show that had built its identity on being the kind of thing certain people disapproved of. The Venezuelan government banned the show in 2008 following an episode that involved marijuana legalization. The country's justice minister cited the episode as promoting drug use, and cable stations were warned they would face fines for continuing to air it. This is the kind of international incident that most television shows never generate, and that Family Guy has managed to generate at several points across its history. Whether this reflects something important about the show's cultural power, or simply about the specific sensitivities of specific regulatory environments at specific moments in time, is a question worth sitting with. The show's relationship to its own legacy has always been somewhat uncomfortable. It knows it is a show. It frequently acknowledges that it is a show. Characters break the fourth wall and reference Fox and the writing staff and the general experience of being a fictional character in a long-running animated series. This self-awareness is sometimes funny and sometimes feels like the show using its awareness of its own problems as a substitute for fixing them. But there is a version of this self-awareness that works very well, and Family Guy has produced some genuinely clever episodes built around the show's knowledge of its own nature. The episode Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie visit the events of the first episode of the show, is an example of the show using its own history productively. Seeing the original 1999 animation through the eyes of characters who have been part of the show for a decade creates a specific kind of nostalgia that the episode handles with real affection. The show's cultural footprint in other countries is something that tends to get overlooked in discussions centered on American media. Family Guy has been broadcast in most of the world's television markets. It has been dubbed into many languages. In some countries, it has a following that exceeds its American audience in terms of proportion of the population. The specific humor translates imperfectly, as all culture-specific humor does, but the emotional core of the show, the family dynamic, the specific warmth that exists underneath the chaos, Those things tend to cross borders more easily than the references to American politicians or regional accents. Section 15. The episodes that changed everything. Within Family Guy's long run, there are specific episodes that mark before and after moments in the show's history. Not just in terms of the show's quality or direction, but in terms of what the show was willing to attempt and what the audience was willing to receive. The Road to Rhode Island, which aired in the first season, established the road to format that would become one of the show's most beloved recurring structures. The episode sent Brian and Stewie on a journey together, away from the rest of the family, and discovered that the combination of their specific personalities produced comedy that neither character could generate alone. Brian's dry resignation and Stewie's theatrical grandiosity create a kind of comedic friction that the show has returned to repeatedly over the years, always finding new angles. The Road to episodes became their own genre within the show. Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the North Pole, Road to India, and others. Each one takes Brian and Stewie out of the Quahog setting and places them in a different environment where their dynamic can be tested against new circumstances. The format gives the writers an excuse to do almost anything they want while still grounding it in the relationship between two characters the audience knows well. The Season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, represented the most ambitious storytelling the show had attempted up to that point. Spread across 2 episodes, it allowed Stewie to actually achieve his long-stated goal of killing his mother, and then extended into Lois returning and the subsequent confrontation. The stakes were real within the episode's fiction. Characters acted as though the events mattered, and the performances, particularly Seth MacFarlane's work as both Stewie and Brian in heightened emotional contexts, were significantly more intense than what the show usually asked for. The twist that ended the two-parter, revealing the entire thing was a simulation on Stewie's computer, was divisive. Some viewers felt cheated. Others felt it was appropriate to the show's sensibility. The debate it generated was itself evidence that the two-parter had done something unusual, had created investment and stakes that the show could then undermine, and that this sequence of events produced genuine feelings in viewers, rather than just laughter. Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 episode, is probably the single most praised episode in the show's history. It contains no cutaway gags. It is set entirely in a bank vault where Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked for a night. For 22 minutes, two characters just talk to each other. They talk about their friendship, about their fears, about what they mean to each other. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. Stewie reveals the depth of his love for Brian in terms that are genuinely moving. The episode works because it trusts the characters. It trusts that after 8 seasons, the audience knows Brian and Stewie well enough that watching them have a real conversation is more interesting than watching them engage in another adventure. It is the show making a bet that character matters more than spectacle, and winning that bet completely. The fact that this episode exists is evidence that Family Guy, at its best, is not just a delivery system for random jokes. It is a show with characters who have accumulated enough history and enough emotional weight that they can sustain a story built entirely on who they are, rather than what they do. Partial Life of Brian, the Season 12 episode where Brian is hit by a car and dies, is the most emotionally charged moment in the show's history, precisely because the audience had been built up to care so much about him by episodes like Brian and Stewie. If Brian had died in Season 2, before the weight of the character had accumulated, it would have been a surprise without resonance. By Season 12, it was devastating. And then the resurrection, 2 episodes later. The internet had things to say about this. Many things. At great length and with considerable passion. The episode A Fistful of Meg, from Season 12, has a sequence involving Meg that fans with long memories cite as one of the show's most surprising moments. Meg, who has been the target of abuse from essentially every direction for many seasons, is placed in a situation that requires her to be genuinely threatening, and the episode commits to this fully enough that it becomes a different kind of character moment than anything Meg had been given before. Seahorse Seashell Party, the Season 10 episode set during a hurricane, is discussed at length elsewhere in this script. What is worth adding here is that the episode is often cited not just for its controversial ending, but for the quality of its construction. The hurricane provides a physical constraint that forces the family to be together, which is a simple and effective dramatic device. The heightened pressure of confinement produces confessions and confrontations that would not have happened in an ordinary episode. And Meg's speech to her family, before the ending undermines it, is one of the most direct pieces of character writing in the show's history. The Simpson Guy, the crossover between Family Guy and The Simpsons that aired in 2014, is one of those television events that demonstrates how much cultural capital both shows had accumulated. Getting The Simpsons universe and the Family Guy universe into the same episode required negotiation between two large creative organizations and the suspension of the usual rules about how these worlds relate to each other. The episode was watched by more viewers than either show typically drew by that point in their respective runs, which said something about the power of novelty in a media landscape that was increasingly fragmented. The crossover produced the obvious jokes, the comparison between Homer and Peter, between Brian and Santa's Little Helper, between Meg and Lisa, but it also produced some unexpectedly genuine moments, including a sequence where Meg and Lisa bond over their shared experience of being undervalued by their respective shows. Lisa, as voiced by Yeardley Smith, tells Meg that she matters and that her talents are real. It is played straight, without irony, and it lands with something like warmth. There is a subtext in that moment about the respective shows' treatment of their least valued female characters. Lisa Simpson has been the subject of considerable creative investment over the years. Meg Griffin has been the subject of considerable creative abuse. When the two characters meet and Lisa tells Meg she matters, the audience hears both the in-universe kindness from one character to another and the implicit acknowledgement from the writers of one show that the writers of the other show have not always been good to their equivalent character. Whether that acknowledgement changes anything is a different question. But the moment exists, and it is one of the things that the crossover episode did that neither show could have done on its own. Section 16. Things the show almost never did. Near misses and what-ifs. Seth MacFarlane almost did not pitch Family Guy to Fox at all. The primary alternative he was considering was to develop the characters further for a different network or a different format. The decision to go to Fox was influenced heavily by the success of King of the Hill, which had demonstrated that animated adult comedy was something Fox could support and that audiences outside of the Simpsons fanbase would watch. Without King of the Hill already existing and working, MacFarlane might have chosen differently. Cree Summer almost was Meg. This has been mentioned already in the Meg section, but it deserves its own contemplation here. Cree Summer's voice is completely different from both Lacey Chabert's and Mila Kunis's. She brings a different energy, a different warmth, to almost every character she has ever voiced. What a Cree Summer Meg Griffin would have sounded like, and how that different sound might have shaped the character's early development, is one of the show's more tantalizing alternative histories. The show was almost not revived. After the cancellation in 2002, the conventional wisdom in the industry was that Family Guy was gone. Getting canceled once is usually fatal for a show. Getting canceled at the end of a third season, which means the network has given you 3 full seasons to prove yourself, is generally understood as a final verdict. The network has seen what you are. They have decided it is not enough. What happened with the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales was not something that anyone planned or expected. It was the first major example of a canceled television show building sufficient post-cancellation audience momentum to justify a revival, and it happened in a specific window between the cancellation of the show and the widespread adoption of DVR and streaming technology that would have distributed that same audience momentum differently if it had happened a few years later. If Family Guy had been canceled in 2002 and not had the Adult Swim window before streaming made cancellation less definitive, it probably would not have come back. The specific combination of the Adult Swim deal, the DVD sales, and the timing of the early internet's ability to carry fan enthusiasm created conditions that had never existed before and that would not exist in quite the same form again. Cleveland Brown almost did not get a spin-off. The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons from 2009 through 2013, was developed at a moment when animated spin-offs from successful parent shows were something networks were cautiously interested in. MacFarlane was involved in the development, though the show was run primarily by others. The decision to separate Cleveland from the Spooner Street Ensemble and give him his own world in Virginia created a character who, upon his return to Family Guy, had 4 seasons of additional history and relationships that the parent show could theoretically draw on but largely chose not to. The spin-off's existence also meant that for 4 years, Family Guy operated without one of its four core friends, which shifted the dynamic of the bar group in ways that the show addressed inconsistently. Sometimes Peter, Joe, and Quagmire acknowledged that Cleveland was absent. Sometimes new characters filled the space. Sometimes the show simply behaved as though the fourth seat were not empty. The death of Brian in season 12 was almost handled differently. There have been reports from people close to the production that the resurrection was not always planned as part of the original story. The public response to the death was so enormous and so sustained, the emotional connection the audience had to Brian so much stronger than anyone had fully anticipated, that the timeline of the resurrection decision is genuinely unclear. Whether Vinny was always meant to be temporary, or whether the audience's response accelerated what had always been the plan, or whether the audience's response changed the plan, depends on who you ask and when you ask them. What is certain is that the character's death generated more genuine cultural conversation than almost any other single Family Guy moment, which in retrospect might have been the best argument for not reversing it. Stories that generate that kind of response are rare. The willingness to let consequences stand, even painful ones, is what separates shows that feel real from shows that feel safe. Stewie was almost not reformed. The decision to move him away from the evil genius characterization and toward the more emotionally accessible version of the character that has existed since roughly season 4 was not inevitable. MacFarlane and the writers made that choice because they felt they had taken the original concept as far as they could. But there is a reasonable argument that the evil genius concept, precisely because it was so original, had more room to grow than they gave it credit for. The show has produced more seasons with the reformed, softer Stewie than it ever produced with the original villainous version. The longevity of the replacement character might itself be the argument that the original choice was correct, but the occasional episodes that give Stewie back some of his original edge, that let him scheme or threaten or build something dangerous, tend to be the episodes that fans of the early show respond to most enthusiastically. The other character arc that almost happened differently was Peter's. There are writers who worked on the show who have said in interviews that Peter's drift toward cruelty in the later seasons was not a conscious creative decision so much as a gradual drift that nobody fully noticed until it had gone quite far. The character became meaner season by season in small increments that only looked large when you compared the season 15 Peter to the season 1 Peter directly. This kind of drift is one of the specific dangers of writing a character for 25 years without always having the original creator's voice in the room to say, wait, this is not who Peter is. The new writers who came in over the years knew Peter from the later seasons and wrote him accordingly. The character's original warmth, the thing that made him sympathetic despite his stupidity, was the most vulnerable element of his design because it was the least dramatic. Cruelty is easy to write. Warmth requires more careful attention. Section 17, The Forgotten Characters, Spooner Street's supporting cast. Recurring characters in Family Guy exist in a particular tier of celebrity. They are known well enough to have dedicated fans who follow their appearances, but they are not developed across any given season to have continuous arcs. They show up, they do their thing, they disappear until the writers need them again. Herbert the Pervert, as he is sometimes called in discussions about the show, lives somewhere on the peripheral edges of the Griffin's neighborhood. He is voiced by Mike Henry, one of the show's long-running writers and voice performers. Herbert is elderly, extremely slow of movement, and speaks in a distinctive voice that suggests both extreme age and a particular kind of mild menace. The jokes around Herbert, which center on his inappropriate interest in young boys, particularly Chris, are among the show's most consistently discussed in terms of whether they are acceptable comedy or something else. The fact that the show has deployed him across many seasons without ever really reckoning with the nature of the comedy suggests that the writers have made a decision about his character that they are not entirely willing to verbalize. Herbert is, whatever else he is, a technically accomplished piece of voice acting. The character requires Mike Henry to maintain a very specific physicality in his voice across every line, a slowness that suggests effort, a vocal texture that suggests age, combined with a content that creates discomfort. The combination is, technically, well executed. The question of whether it should be executed at all is separate from the question of how well it is done. Mort Goldman's pharmacy has been a fixture on the show since early seasons, and Mort himself, voiced by John G. Quigley in early appearances and then by Ricky Gervais in later ones, is one of those characters whose cultural specificity has generated its own discussion. He is presented as a Jewish man in a way that draws on a specific tradition of Jewish comedy, while also sometimes crossing into territory that makes viewers uncomfortable for reasons that are not always easy to articulate. His son, Neil Goldman, as mentioned in the Chris section, is voiced by Seth Green and functions primarily as the character through whom the show explores teenage male romantic obsession in its most harmlessly absurd form. Neil's persistent pursuit of Meg is treated as comedy rather than concern, which is consistent with the show's general approach to teenage behavior. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, has an interesting trajectory across the show's run. In early seasons, she is defined almost entirely by her pregnancy, a recurring condition that the show treated as a background detail for far too long. Once Susie was born, Bonnie became a more developed character, someone with her own frustrations about her marriage and her own interior life that the show occasionally explored. Jennifer Tilly, who voices Bonnie, is a recognizable actress whose film career includes roles that are far more dramatically ambitious than a supporting character on an animated comedy. Her Bonnie is a piece of sustained voice acting that most viewers take entirely for granted, a specific voice that functions within the show's sound environment without calling attention to itself. The giant chicken, Ernie, deserves more consideration than he typically receives in discussions of the show's supporting characters. He is, technically, a recurring antagonist. His periodic fights with Peter are among the most elaborate things the show ever commits animation budget to. And his origin story, which the show has provided in fragments across several seasons, turns out to be one of the more complete character backstories outside the main family. Ernie was first introduced in a Season 2 episode called Da Boom, which actually aired as the first episode of the Revival-era production before the show was canceled. The chicken's original offense was giving Peter a coupon that had expired. The subsequent fight was so out of proportion to the original offense that it became the joke, and the character became permanent because the joke worked. What the later appearances of Ernie establish is that he actually has a family, a life, relationships, grievances of his own that exist outside his periodic encounters with Peter Griffin. The show has done small-scale storytelling around Ernie that treats him as a real person within the show's universe, rather than just a giant chicken who shows up to fight. These moments are some of the most unexpectedly tender things the show has done with a supporting character. Tom Tucker, the news anchor voiced by McFarlane using a voice very close to his natural register, has been one of the show's most consistent recurring presences outside the main cast. Tucker is pompous, self-important, professionally skilled, and possessed of a son whose head is upside down. He anchors the local news with the same energy that local television news anchors have always projected, that specific combination of authority and irrelevance that is particular to the local news format. The news segments, when they appear, serve as an efficient way to introduce information or plot developments into the show while also being comedy in themselves. Tucker's particular brand of self-serious journalism is funny in a way that does not require any knowledge of Family Guy's history. It is immediately readable as a parody of a type. Diane Simmons, Tucker's co-anchor who appeared in the show's early and middle seasons, was eventually given a significant story arc in a Season 9 episode that used her as the vehicle for a more dramatically serious plotline than the character had previously been associated with. The arc culminated in Simmons's death, which the show handled with more weight than it typically brings to supporting character exits. The actress Lori Allen, who voiced Simmons, has cited the arc as one of the more satisfying creative experiences of her time on the show. Joyce Kinney, who replaced Simmons as Tucker's co-anchor, was given her own complicated backstory involving a history with Lois that the show used for a full episode. The willingness to invest a new recurring character with a specific and personal history that connected to an established main character showed the writing room at a particular level of craft. Section 18. Things you only notice on a rewatch. There is a specific experience of rewatching Family Guy episodes from the early seasons that longtime fans describe in similar terms regardless of when they first started watching the show. It is the experience of noticing things that were invisible the first time, not because they were hidden but because you did not yet have the context to see them. The visual gags that run in the background of scenes, the information in the mise-en-scene that the camera never calls attention to, the consistency details that the animation team built into the world of the show without expecting viewers to catch them in a first viewing. Quagmire's house, as mentioned earlier, has hidden beds everywhere. This is a detail that viewers who know about it suddenly see in every establishing shot of the interior. Once you know, you start looking. There they are, behind the couch, folded into the wall. In the ceiling, somehow, the animators committed to this bit fully enough that it rewards hunting. Brian's Prius has details that change over time. The bumper sticker supporting Dennis Kucinich's 2004 presidential campaign is an example of a specific timestamp built into a recurring visual element. It places the car in a specific cultural moment, and then lets that moment slowly become historical as the show continues. By the later seasons, a 2004 Kucinich sticker on a Prius is a very specific piece of dated liberal aesthetics, which is consistent with who Brian has always been trying to be. Peter's various background occupations, the ones he cycles through in episodes that require him to have a job other than the brewery, sometimes leave traces in later episodes if you know where to look. An item on a shelf, a piece of equipment, a reference in dialogue. The show's world has more internal continuity than it officially claims credit for. The way Stewie's bedroom changes over the seasons is one of the more consistent evolution arcs in the show's visual history. In the very early episodes, it is more definitively a baby's room with sinister elements inserted. By later seasons, it has become increasingly a research and development facility with a token crib to maintain appearances. The evolution mirrors the character's evolution, the baby becoming more scientist and less infant. The Drunken Clam's interior has been rendered inconsistently across different animation studios and different seasons, but certain elements persist. The bar itself, the specific stools, the window that looks out onto the street. These anchors give the location a visual continuity that allows it to function as a reliable place even when the specific details around it shift. The show's title card appears with minimal variation at the start of every episode, but the content around it, the production logos, the disclaimers, the network identifiers, has changed multiple times across 25 years of production. Watching these changes across a full series rewatch is a way of experiencing the corporate history of American broadcasting through the lens of a single show. The voice of Meg in the first few episodes of the series, if you listen carefully, shifts subtly between Lacey Chabert and Mila Kunis. Some episodes that aired in Season 2 were actually recorded during Season 1, which means the voice you hear depends on production scheduling rather than broadcast order. Fans who have mapped this out carefully have produced charts of which voice appears in which episode, which is the kind of dedicated attention that long-running shows develop ecosystems around. The physical movements of the characters, their specific ways of gesturing and moving through space, have become more stylized and sometimes more restricted across the show's history, as different animation teams have approached the designs with different philosophies. The early Stewie had a particular way of turning his enormous head that felt physically plausible for a baby. Later, Stewie's movements are cleaner and more predictable. Neither is wrong. They are different visual languages for the same character. Brian's drinking is one of the show's most consistent visual details, always present, always specific. He holds his glass in a particular way. The martini is always dry. The act of drinking is never played for laughs on its own, just as an established fact about who he is. This restraint, choosing to let the drinking be character information rather than a punchline, is one of the ways the show communicated something true about Brian's relationship to alcohol without ever having to state it directly. The show has, across its history, made specific choices about what to leave implicit rather than explicit. Peter's Irish heritage is never the subject of an episode dedicated to explaining it, but is always present as texture. Brian's abandonment issues are never psychologized directly, but inform everything he does. Quagmire's fundamental loneliness, beneath the relentless pursuit of women, is never stated, but is there in every episode where he interacts with the world without succeeding in connecting to it in the way he seems to want. These implicit layers are what make a rewatch different from a first viewing. The show's surface is loud and direct and frequently absurd. But the characters' interiority, their specific and sometimes contradictory psychological realities, are built into the show quietly enough that you can watch a season and laugh at the jokes without ever consciously noticing them. And then you come back years later and something registers differently. You notice the Kucinich sticker, You catch Brian's specific expression in a moment where the script does not specify that he should look sad, but he does anyway. You see Stewie hold Rupert in a way that the baby character never would, but the infant who misses his mother always does. The show is in there, underneath the noise and the cutaways and the chaos. It was built by people who cared enough to put it there, and it rewards the kind of slow, quiet attention you might be giving it right now. Section 19, the music of Family Guy songs, scores, and Seth's other talent. Seth MacFarlane is a genuinely talented singer. This is not a fact that most people who know him primarily from Family Guy fully appreciate, because the show exists in a comedic context where musical performance is usually in service of a joke. But MacFarlane's musical ability is the real thing. He has released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards. His debut album, Music is Better Than Words, came out in 2011 and featured big band arrangements of songs that would have been at home in the Rat Pack era. The album reached number 7 on the Billboard 200 chart and demonstrated an audience for MacFarlane as a musical performer rather than just a comedy creator. This musical ability runs throughout Family Guy in ways that are easy to miss. The show's original score, composed by Walter Murphy, is a functional piece of work that serves the show's comedic needs without calling attention to itself. Murphy has provided music for the show since its earliest episodes and has developed a relationship with the show's rhythms and needs that gives the score a consistency across seasons. But the original songs that appear in episodes, the ones the characters perform within the narrative, draw directly on MacFarlane's musical knowledge. The parody songs are accurate parodies. The musical style references in the cutaways reflect genuine familiarity with the forms being referenced. The Road to the North Pole's musical sequences work not just as jokes, but as actual songs that function within their musical tradition. The theme song itself, written by MacFarlane and sung by the Griffin family in that opening sequence, is a genuinely constructed piece of music that parodies the tradition of animated family sitcoms while also being catchy enough to function as an actual theme. You can find recordings of people performing the Family Guy theme on real instruments in real concert halls, which is not something you can say about every television theme song. Stewie's relationship to Broadway, discussed briefly in his character section, connects to MacFarlane's own genuine interest in theater and musical performance. The show has produced multiple episodes centered on theatrical performance, on singing, on the specific combination of music and comedy that defines a certain tradition of American entertainment. These episodes tend to be the ones where MacFarlane's personal passions are most visible. Brian's musical interests in jazz and opera are also specific enough to reflect genuine knowledge rather than general hand-waving at cultural sophistication. The specific recordings referenced, the specific performers mentioned, the specific moments in jazz history that Brian alludes to across the show's run, suggest someone writing those details had actually listened to the music being discussed. Peter's musical taste, running heavily toward 1970s and 1980s rock and pop, is another specific period choice that anchors the character in a generational identity. The songs Peter knows, the songs he performs when he has occasion to perform them, the music he has in his head, all of this is consistent with a man born in the early 1960s who absorbed his formative musical influences from the FM radio of his teenage years. The show's musical choices for cutaways are worth their own attention. When the show deploys a song in a cutaway, the specific song is always chosen for a reason, even when that reason is as simple as this is a song from the exact era and cultural space the joke requires. The specificity of these choices reflects a writing room with a shared and detailed knowledge of American popular music history. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared multiple times across several seasons and which involved the show simply cutting to an extended performance of a Conway Twitty song rather than a joke, is the most discussed example of the show's relationship to music as comedy. Conway Twitty was a country music star of the 1970s and early 1980s, known for a specific kind of emotive country ballad that has a particular period quality. Using him as the subject of a running gag about the show not having enough material to fill its runtime is a specific choice about which artist to commit to, and the specificity makes the gag funnier than a generic country artist would have been. The road to episodes frequently include original songs written for the specific adventure Brian and Stewie are on, and these songs tend to be among the more crafted pieces of music the show produces. They function within the episode as genuine musical numbers rather than as parodies, which means they need to work as songs while also working as comedy within the context of the characters and the story. McFarlane's ability to write and perform in this mode, to produce a song that functions as an actual piece of music while also being funny, is one of the show's distinguishing technical abilities. It is not something every animated comedy can do, and it is not something that gets enough credit in discussions of what makes Family Guy work at its best. Section 20. Final thoughts and falling asleep to Family Guy. There is something specific about the experience of falling asleep to a show you know very well. The familiar voices become a kind of sonic environment, an auditory landscape that you have spent enough time with to find genuinely soothing. You know what Peter sounds like when he is about to do something foolish. You know the specific rhythm of Brian's dry responses. You know Stewie's cadences by now, the particular way certain words land in his falsetto British voice that he is actually faking, but that has become so associated with the character that you cannot imagine him any other way. These voices have been part of the background of American life for more than 25 years. People have grown up with them. People have watched the show with their parents or their children, or alone at midnight when the apartment was quiet. People have had their difficult nights made slightly less difficult by the consistent presence of this animated family in Rhode Island going through chaos and emerging, always, on the other side of it. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. The facts we have covered tonight, the $50,000 pilot, Paul Timmons, the security guard who became Peter Griffin, the Rex Harrison falsetto that became Stewie's armor, Seth MacFarlane's natural voice in the body of a talking dog, 3 women before Mila Kunis, a Silence of the Lambs villain who became a teenager, the radio DJs of the 1950s in Quagmire's mouth, the Hungarian Long Island cousin immortalized as Lois, the quahog that looks like Cranston, the Super Bowl that gave 22 million people their first glimpse of the Griffins. All of these facts are the hidden architecture of something you thought you already knew. Shows seem simpler from the outside than they are from the inside. Every decision that went into creating these characters, from the shape of Peter's head to the depth of Stewie's self-deception to the specific brand of car Brian drives, came from somewhere real. From a person the creator knew, a performance a voice actor loved, a cultural reference that lodged in a writer's memory and found its way onto the screen. The show is built from all of that. The facts are not footnotes to the show. They are the show, at the level where the real work happens, before the animation and the editing and the broadcast and the millions of viewers. At the level of a young man in a kitchen in Connecticut drawing by hand for 6 months for $50,000 because something about these characters felt worth bringing to life. The characters are still alive. After 25 years and more than 500 episodes and 2 cancellations and 2 revivals and a deal that extends them through their 30th anniversary, they are still there on Spooner Street. Peter is still getting into something inadvisable. Brian is still watching him with the patience of someone who has considered leaving and decided not to. Stewie is still in his room with Rupert and the time machine and the accent that is not his accent and the plans that may or may not be real. Meg is still in the hallway wanting someone to look at her. Lois is still sighing. Chris is still being earnest and slightly confused. Quagmire is still giggitying. Joe is still driving through whatever comes next with absolute authority. They do not age. They do not stop. And tonight, they are here, as quiet and familiar as breathing, letting you drift off into something that feels a little like home. Good night. End of script. Total runtime approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed this video, a like before you close your eyes would mean everything. Subscribe so the algorithm knows you want more of this. And drop a comment when you wake up or if you are still watching in the dark. Tell us something you did not know before tonight. Sleep well, wherever you are. End of document. Bonus section. Deep dives into character details, the facts within the facts. We have covered the main characters at a broad level, but there are layers within the layers, details that emerge only when you look at specific episodes or specific moments in the show's production history that reveal something unexpected about these people we have been spending time with. Peter Griffin's glasses are one of those details. The thick-framed rectangular glasses that Peter has worn since the show's premiere were, as we have established, visually inspired by Paul Timmons, the security guard from RISD. But what the show has never explained, and what most viewers have never asked about, is why Peter needs glasses at all within the show's fiction. He needs them because he genuinely cannot see clearly without them. In a few episodes across the show's run, the consequences of Peter being without his glasses become plot relevant. He mistakes objects, misidentifies people, navigates the world in a blur. The glasses are not purely a visual design choice. They are character information. Peter Griffin genuinely has bad eyesight, which makes certain of his decisions even more understandable, given that he is doing everything he does while not being entirely sure what he is looking at. His favorite beer within the show's universe is Pawtucket Patriot Ale, which is the brand produced by the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery where he works. This creates a specific relationship between Peter and his workplace that is not often commented on. He does not just work for a brewery. He works for the brewery that produces the beer he would choose to drink anyway. This is an unusual and favorable alignment of professional responsibility and personal preference. In most episodes, Peter's beer consumption is simply background. But there is something almost admirable about a man who has achieved perfect coherence between what he does and what he loves. The Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, where Peter worked in the earliest seasons before his move to the brewery, has its own history within the show. The factory was owned by a man named Mr. Weed, who was a recurring character in seasons 1 and 2 before dying in an unusual and somewhat abrupt episode. Mr. Weed's death, which was treated as a definitive narrative conclusion to that chapter of Peter's professional life, was one of the earlier examples of the show being willing to permanently remove a supporting character without a great deal of ceremony. Peter's relationship to the television in the Griffin family's living room is one of the show's most consistent and most specific characterizations. He watches television with a quality of attention that is both complete and completely passive. He absorbs what he watches. He has strong opinions about what he watches. He prioritizes his television time in ways that occasionally create conflict with his family's needs. His pop culture knowledge, which is extensive and specific to the 1970s and 1980s, comes from those hours in front of the screen. In multiple episodes, the show has used Peter's television viewing as a way to introduce reference material. He watches something and it inspires him, or he watches something and it terrifies him, or he watches something and it gives him an idea that immediately goes wrong in a specific and predictable way. The television is, in a sense, the show's most reliable story engine. The character who watches television most voraciously is also the character most susceptible to being influenced by what he watches, which gives the writers an infinitely renewable source of episode premises. Lois Griffin's piano is another detail that disappears from the show after the earliest seasons, and that represents a small casualty of the show's gradual simplification of its characters. In seasons 1 and 2, Lois gives piano lessons. This is something she is good at. This is something she has chosen to offer to the world outside her family. It is a small piece of professional identity that exists independent of her role as wife and mother. By the later seasons, the piano lessons are gone. They are not addressed. They are simply not part of her life anymore, and the show never explains why. This is the kind of quiet character detail that the show lost as it grew and as the pressure to find new stories increased. Giving up the piano lessons is not a story. It is just the gradual disappearance of something that once made Lois feel more fully realized. Her wealthy background, the Pewterschmidt family and their money and their expectations, is a recurring source of plot for the show in a way that the piano lessons could never be. Carter Pewterschmidt's contempt for Peter is reliable comedy. Barbara Pewterschmidt's quiet disappointment in the match her daughter made produces its own specific dynamics. The family wealth creates both conflict and resource, depending on what the episode needs. The show has never fully resolved the question of how much Pewterschmidt money influences the Griffin's life. In some episodes, the family is clearly working class, managing on Peter's brewery salary, dealing with financial constraints that feel real. In other episodes, Lois's family wealth appears as a resource that can solve problems, and the inconsistency is never addressed. The show's world bends to what the story needs, rather than maintaining strict economic logic. Stewie's time machine is one of the show's most flexible and most abused plot devices. It appears when a story needs it and disappears when a story does not. Its mechanics are inconsistent. The rules about what it can and cannot do change episode to episode. The version of time travel that Stewie's machine produces is not committed to any particular theory of how time travel might work, which is probably appropriate for a show that has never been committed to any particular theory of continuity. The machine's most significant deployment, the one that brought Brian back from the dead in Season 12's Christmas Guy, is also the one that most clearly demonstrates the emotional weight the device can carry when the show wants it to. Stewie does not use the machine lightly in that episode. He gets it from a version of himself, borrows it, travels back, saves Brian. The mechanics are hand-waved. What matters is the love behind the action. Stewie goes back through time to save his best friend, because the alternative is a world without Brian, and that world, as it turns out, is not one Stewie can accept. That is the character at his most emotionally open, and it is the character that the later seasons have built toward. Someone whose capacity for feeling is enormous, and mostly expressed sideways and through action, rather than through direct statement. Brian's novel, the unfinished magnum opus he has been working on since before the show began, is never given a title within the show's fiction. This is a specific, creative choice. The novel exists as a concept, as an aspiration, as the primary symbol of everything Brian wants to be and has not managed to become. Giving it a title would make it concrete in a way that the show resists. It works better as an abstraction, as the thing Brian has not yet done, rather than as a specific thing that could be evaluated on its own terms. The novel's contents are similarly undefined. We know it exists. We know Brian works on it. We know it is serious literary fiction rather than genre work. But what it is about, who its characters are, what Brian is trying to say in it, these things are never specified. The novel is what Brian aspires to be, not what Brian has made. And that distinction is one of the most honest things the show has done with the character across its run. Glenn Quagmire's age, canonically 61, as established by his driver's license in the Foxy Lady episode, is one of the show's more quietly poignant details when you take it seriously. Quagmire is older than he looks. Considerably older, given that his face and his energy suggest someone in his mid-30s at most. He maintains this through a carrot-based dietary practice that the show introduces without explanation, and that the audience accepts because the show's world accepts it. But the actual number, 61, places Quagmire in a specific generational context. He was born in 1953, which means he came of age in the 1970s, which means his formative years of social development happened during the sexual revolution and its immediate aftermath. He is not behaving like a man from 2005 or 2015. He is behaving like a man whose understanding of masculinity and romance was shaped by a very specific era of American history, and whose personality fossilized there. The 1950s radio DJ inspiration that MacFarlane used for the voice is slightly off the mark chronologically from Quagmire's actual biography as established within the show. The 1950s would have been Quagmire's childhood rather than his formative adult years. But the sensibility, the specific kind of swinging bachelor confidence that defined American masculine culture in that era, is exactly right as a description of who Quagmire is emotionally, even if the mathematics of his biography do not quite line up. Joe Swanson's physical therapy, which is never really a subject the show explores, is an interesting absence in the character's history. Joe is a paraplegic police officer who maintains extraordinary upper body strength and athletic ability. He goes to the gym, he plays racquetball, he participates in physically demanding situations regularly. The discipline required to maintain that level of physical capability in the context of a spinal injury is never commented on, and yet it is clearly happening. Joe is, in this specific sense, the most quietly determined character on the show. He has been dealt a genuinely difficult hand, and he has simply played it. Patrick Warburton's background before Family Guy included extensive voice work that helped him develop the specific vocal authority he brings to Joe. He had voiced characters in video games, in other animated series, in commercials. The skill of making a voice sound physically grounded, of making a character sound like they have a body that the listener can imagine, is something that requires more technique than it appears to from the outside. Warburton makes Joe sound solid. Every line lands with weight. This is not accidental. Cleveland Brown's auctioneer past, the detail about the totem pole that permanently altered his speech, is one of those retroactive character explanations that the show has deployed more successfully than average. Cleveland's slow, deliberate way of speaking is one of his most recognizable traits. Explaining it as an acquired characteristic rather than a natural one adds a layer of history to the character that is completely unnecessary from a story perspective, but that enriches him as a person within the world. The totem pole incident suggests Cleveland was once a very different person than he currently is. Faster, more energetic. A professional whose entire identity was built on speed of delivery. That person is gone, replaced by someone whose pace is different but whose emotional intelligence is intact. The auctioneer who became the deli owner through an act of random misfortune is a small character tragedy, and the show has never made a big deal of it, which makes it more touching rather than less. Meg Griffin's full first name is Megan, though she has gone by Meg throughout the show's run. The name Megan is a Welsh name meaning strong and capable, which has a particular irony given the show's treatment of the character for much of its history. She is, etymologically, someone capable of endurance and strength, and the later seasons eventually allowed the character to express those qualities after a long period of not allowing her to be much of anything except a target. The voice change between Lacey Chabert and Mila Kunis is audible to listeners who know to listen for it, and it is most pronounced in the emotional register of Meg's more distressed moments. Chabert brings a slightly warmer, more naturally teenager-sounding quality to the voice. Kunis brings something flatter, more resigned, more exhausted. Both are valid interpretations of a character dealing with a difficult home environment. They are simply different interpretations shaped by different performers, bringing different instincts to the same role. Chris Griffin's love of art, his passion for drawing and visual creativity, is the character's most consistent trait across the show's long history. He draws. He has always drawn, and the show occasionally gives him moments where this talent is recognized and validated in ways that his other attributes rarely are. He is not academically accomplished. He is not athletically distinguished. He has not inherited his father's gift for enthusiastic incompetence, which is itself a kind of talent, but he can draw, and that is his. The tonal evolution of Chris's voice across 25 years of Seth Green's performance has been subtle but real. The character is less obviously Buffalo Bill-derived now than in the earliest episodes. The voice has grown into itself, found its own rhythms that owe less to the original inspiration and more to who Chris Griffin has become across hundreds of episodes. This is one of the small miracles of long-form character work. The voice actor and the character grow together, and by the end they belong to each other in ways that the beginning could not have predicted. The show will continue through season 27 at minimum, through the 30th anniversary, through whatever the television landscape looks like in 2028 and 2029. The characters will be there, ageless in the way animated characters always are, finding new misadventures and new cutaways and new moments of quiet warmth underneath the noise. Peter will be Peter, Brian will watch him, Stewie will scheme, Lois will sigh. Meg will stand in the hallway trying. Chris will draw something somewhere. Quagmire will giggity. Joe will drive. And somewhere in a very specific and well-researched version of Cranston, Rhode Island, the show's world will continue to exist in the way fictional worlds always continue to exist. Entirely and completely, as long as someone is watching. You are watching. Or you were. Until the screen started to blur and the words started to soften and the familiar voices became a kind of comfortable noise that was carrying you somewhere slow and warm. That is all right. That is exactly what this was for. Sleep well.